The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery, illuminating thousands of white headstones in golden light. James Iron Jim Callahan stood motionless before a particular grave, his weathered hand resting on the cool marble. At 58, Jim's once powerful frame remained imposing despite the slight stoop in his shoulders. His silver hair, cut in the same military style he'd worn for 40 years, caught the early light. 30 years, Frank, he whispered to the headstone. Hard to believe it's been that long. The inscription read, Frank Wilson, Master Sergeant, U.S. Army, Operation Desert Storm, beloved husband, father, soldier. Jim placed a small metal object on top of the headstone. It glinted in the sunlight, a silver pin in the shape of a wolf's head with ruby eyes. The emblem of the Iron Wolves, their tank battalion in Desert Storm. Around him, the cemetery was quiet except for the distant sound of another memorial service and the rhythmic clicking of the honor guard's heels at the tomb of the unknown soldier. This hallowed ground had become familiar territory over the decades. Too familiar. The images came flooding back, as vivid as they had been 30 years ago. February 26, 1991, the vast desert of Iraq, the sandstorm that appeared out of nowhere, the night vision glowing green, the radio crackling with urgent reports of enemy movement. Jim's tank platoon, the Iron Wolves, had been leading the charge in the now legendary Battle of 73 Easting. History books called it the last great tank battle of the 20th century. For the men who fought there, it was simply hell on earth. We were outnumbered 3-1, Jim said softly to the headstone. But those Republican Guard boys didn't know what hit them. In his mind, he could still hear the thunderous boom of the M1A1 Abrams 120mm main gun, feel the violent shudder as the massive tank rocked backward with each shot. Through his thermal sight, he had watched Iraqi T-72s explode one after another, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular fireballs that pierced the swirling sandstorm. The Iron Wolves had destroyed 28 enemy tanks that night without a single American casualty. It should have been a perfect victory. Until the next morning. Should have been me in that truck, Frank, not you. The cleanup operations, the supposedly secured area, the unmarked Iraqi mine that took out their Humvee. Frank had volunteered to transport ammunition. Jim was supposed to go with him, but stayed behind to coordinate with command. The explosion had killed Frank instantly. Jim pulled a silver flask from inside his dress uniform jacket, unscrewed the cap, and poured a small measure of whiskey onto the ground before the headstone. Still drinking that cheap stuff? Came a voice from behind him. Jim turned to see Ray Martinez approaching, dressed in full military honors like himself. At 55, Ray's face carried the deep lines of a man who had seen too much combat, but his smile remained the same as it had been when they were young tankers together. Only on special occasions, Jim replied, offering the flask. Ray took it, raised it slightly toward Frank's grave, and took a short drink. The rest of the guys send their respects. Danner's hip replacement is acting up, and Wilson's on an Alaskan cruise with the grandkids. Wilson always did have better timing than his old man, Jim said with a sad smile. They stood in silence for a moment, two old soldiers paying respects to a fallen brother. You still teaching at Knox? Ray asked finally. Jim nodded. Armor officer training. Bunch of kids who think tank warfare is obsolete in the age of drones and cyber attacks. What do you tell them? That there's nothing more terrifying than 70 tons of American steel coming over a ridgeline with its gun pointed at you. Jim allowed himself a small grin. No delete button for that. Ray laughed, the sound oddly comforting among the graves. Jim's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. You should get that, Ray said. Could be Sarah. Jim shook his head. Sarah knows where I am today. The phone vibrated again, insistent. With a sigh, Jim pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His expression changed immediately. Pentagon? Ray asked, recognizing the look. Jim nodded, staring at the message. Colonel Callahan, urgent. Report to SecDef office 1400 today. National security matter. Transport arranged. They're calling you back in? Ray asked incredulously. Looks that way. Jim pocketed the phone and turned back to Frank's grave. What do you think, old friend? One more mission for an old tank jockey? The headstone offered no reply, but as a cloud passed overhead, a beam of sunlight struck the wolf pin, making the ruby eyes glow like fire. Jim straightened his back, suddenly looking every inch the warrior he had been 30 years before. Ray, I might need your help with something. Name it, Colonel. Tell Sarah I'll be late for dinner. Chapter 2. The General and the Mission. The Pentagon never changed. Decades passed, wars began and ended, administrations came and went, but these hallways remained the same. Immaculate, intimidating, impersonal. Jim walked briskly alongside a young captain who'd met him at the entrance, his dress shoes clicking on the polished floor. "The secretary is finishing up with the Joint Chiefs, sir," the captain explained. "General West asked if you'd mind waiting in her office." Jim stopped mid-stride. "Eleanor West?" "Yes, sir. She's heading up this operation." A genuine smile crossed Jim's face for the first time that day. Eleanor West. Now that was a name from the past. The captain led him to an office door bearing a simple nameplate. LT General Eleanor West, Special Operations Command. "The general said to make yourself comfortable, sir," the captain said, opening the door. "She'll be with you shortly." Jim entered the spacious office and immediately spotted the display case on the wall. Inside was a battered tanker's helmet with a distinctive wolf emblem painted on the side. The Iron Wolves. "You always were sentimental, Ellie," he murmured. "Only about the things worth remembering, Jim." He turned to see Lieutenant General Eleanor West standing in the doorway. At 57, she remained as formidable as when she had commanded the adjacent tank company during Desert Storm. Her hair, now silver but still kept in the same no-nonsense style, framed a face that had grown more distinguished with age. 3 stars gleamed on each shoulder of her immaculate uniform. "It's been too long," she said, crossing the room to embrace him briefly. 3 stars look good on you, Ellie. And retirement looks terrible on you." She gestured to a sitting area. "Coffee?" "Black, 2 sugars. Some things don't change." "More than you'd think." She poured 2 cups from a carafe and handed him one. "I saw you were at Arlington today." Jim nodded. 30 years. Frank would be proud of what his son has accomplished. Jim looked up sharply. "Michael, you've seen him?" "I've done more than see him, Jim. I've been monitoring his career since West Point. He's a captain now, commands an Abrams crew with the 3rd Armored Division." "Like father, like son," Jim said softly, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. He hadn't seen Michael since the funeral. The boy had been only 4 years old, clutching his mother's hand, looking up at Jim with accusatory eyes that somehow knew this uniformed man was responsible for his father not coming home. Eleanor sat across from him, leaning forward. "That's partly why you're here, Jim. We're facing a situation that requires your unique expertise, and Michael's." Jim's expression hardened. "I'm retired, Ellie. I teach cadets how to drive tanks, not command them into battle. This isn't a standard deployment." She reached for a tablet on the coffee table and tapped the screen. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest level." She handed him the tablet. On the screen was satellite imagery of what appeared to be a small, sleek vessel cutting through water at high speed, barely visible even in the enhanced image. "What am I looking at?" "That's the problem. Our best radar systems can barely detect it." Eleanor tapped the screen again, showing a different angle. "This was captured last week off the coast of Yemen." The vessel disappeared from all tracking systems moments later. Jim studied the image, his brow furrowed. "Stealth technology on a naval vessel this small? We're calling it ghost hull. It's a composite material that absorbs radar waves instead of reflecting them. Combined with its low profile and advanced propulsion system, it's nearly invisible to conventional detection methods." "Who has this capability?" "That's the other problem." Eleanor's expression darkened. "We developed it." She tapped the screen again to show a photograph of a middle-aged man in a lab coat, standing proudly next to what appeared to be a scale model of the vessel. Dr. Adrian Reeves, former DARPA scientist, specialized in stealth materials. 2 years ago, he disappeared with terabytes of classified research data. 6 months ago, he was confirmed killed in a drone strike in Yemen. But his work survived, Jim concluded, and has been weaponized. Eleanor took the tablet back. "Intelligence indicates a non-state actor has acquired at least 6 of these vessels and is planning to use them for attacks on U.S. naval assets, possibly within the next 30 days. Jim set his coffee down. "And what does this have to do with me, or Michael Wilson?" Eleanor stood and walked to a wall safe behind her desk. She entered a complex code, pressed her thumb to a scanner, and removed a thick folder with red borders and Phoenix Deterrent stamped across the top. "The ghost hull technology renders our standard naval defenses nearly useless," she explained, returning to her seat. "The vessels are too small and fast for conventional targeting systems. By the time our ships detect them, they'll already be within strike range." She opened the folder and pushed it toward Jim. Inside were technical specifications for what appeared to be a modified M1A3 Abrams tank. "We need an alternative targeting solution that doesn't rely on radar or standard maritime defenses," Eleanor continued. "Something unexpected. something our enemies won't have countermeasures for. Jim flipped through the pages, his expert eye quickly assessing the modifications to the Abrams. The main gun had been slightly reconfigured, the fire control system extensively modified. "You want to use tanks as coastal defense weapons," he said, not as a question, but in realization. Eleanor nodded. "Specifically, we want to deploy modified Abrams tanks at strategic coastal positions to intercept these vessels before they can reach their targets." Jim leaned back, running a hand through his silver hair. "It's not unprecedented. The Germans used 88mm flak guns against British destroyers at Tobruk in 1942, sank the HMS Sikh that way. Which is exactly why you're here, Jim. You wrote your master's thesis on adaptive weapon systems in World War II. You understand how conventional weapons can be repurposed for unconventional threats." "And Michael?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Captain Wilson is our most qualified young tank commander. His crew holds the top marksmanship scores in the entire armored division. We need the best." Jim stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Potomac River flowing past the Pentagon. For a moment he saw not the calm waters of the river but the endless sands of Iraq, felt the desert heat instead of the air-conditioned comfort of Eleanor's office. "There's something you're not telling me, Ellie." She was silent for a long moment. "The leader of this terrorist group, we've identified him." "And?" "It's Victor Kane." Jim turned sharply, disbelief etched on his face. "Victor is dead. Died in Afghanistan 2005. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "We thought so. Intel now confirms he survived. He spent the last 15 years building this network, developing these weapons, and now he's ready to use them." Jim felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Victor Kane, former Delta Force, one of the best special operators the Army had ever produced, and the man who had nearly killed Jim during a training exercise gone wrong at Fort Irwin in 1998. "This is personal for him," Jim said quietly. "Yes, and now it's personal for us." Eleanor stood and joined him at the window. "I need you on this, Jim, not just for your expertise, but because you know how he thinks. And I need Michael because he has the skills we require." "Michael doesn't know me, Ellie. He blames me for his father's death." "Then perhaps it's time to change that." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "The Secretary of Defense has authorized me to offer you temporary reinstatement to active duty, full colonel's rank, with all privileges and responsibilities." Jim stared out at the river, weighing decades of history against an uncertain future. "When do we start?" he finally asked. "The team assembles at Fort Bliss in 48 hours. You'll have full operational authority under my command." Jim turned to face her, his expression now that of the battle-hardened tank commander who had led men into combat. "One condition." "Name it." "Ray Martinez joins the team. He's the best master gunner in the Corps, and I trust him with my life." Eleanor smiled. "Already processed his reactivation papers this morning." "You were that sure I'd say yes?" "I was that sure America still needs you, Jim. We both know you never really left." As if to punctuate her words, Jim's gaze fell on the battered tanker's helmet in the display case. The wolf emblem, a reminder of battles past and now battles to come. "The Iron Wolves ride again," he said softly. Chapter 3. Family and Responsibility. The suburban Virginia home looked exactly as it had when Jim had left that morning. But now, returning in the fading light of early evening, everything felt different. The carefully tended garden, the comfortable porch swing, the warm glow from the windows, all seemed suddenly precious, fragile. Jim sat in his car for several minutes, gathering his thoughts, rehearsing what he would say to Sarah. After 35 years of marriage, she would know something was wrong the moment she saw his face. Finally, he took a deep breath, grabbed his cover from the passenger seat, and walked to the front door. The smell of pot roast, his favorite, greeted him as he entered. Sarah's way of honoring what this day meant to him. From the kitchen came the sound of her humming softly to herself, a habit she'd had since they first met at Fort Knox when she was an Army nurse and he a young lieutenant. "That you, Jim?" she called. "Yes," he answered, hanging his dress uniform cap on the hook by the door. "Sorry I'm late." Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. At 55, she remained beautiful to him, her auburn hair now streaked with elegant silver. Laugh lines around her eyes speaking to a life of joy despite the hardships of a military family. Her smile faded as she saw his expression. "What is it?" Jim opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the back door opened and their daughter Lisa burst in. "Dad, you're finally home. Mark and I were starting to think you'd forgotten about dinner." Lisa, 30 years old and the image of her mother, crossed the room to embrace him. "Lisa, I thought you were in Baltimore this week," Jim said, genuinely surprised as he returned his daughter's hug. "Changed my shifts at the hospital. No way I'd miss today," she said, pulling back to study his face. As a trauma surgeon, Lisa had developed the same keen ability as her mother to read people's expressions. "What's happened?" "Let's sit down," Jim suggested, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I'll get the whiskey." 10 minutes later, the three of them sat in the living room, Jim having changed into civilian clothes. Mark, Lisa's husband, had joined them, his muscular frame fitting uncomfortably in the overstuffed armchair. At 32, Mark Carson was a captain in the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment, currently on leave between deployments. "They're reactivating you?" Sarah asked incredulously after Jim had explained his meeting at the Pentagon. "At your age? After what happened last time?" "It's a special assignment, Sarah. Advisory role mostly." "Bullshit," Mark said, then quickly added, "Sir, with respect." Jim almost smiled. Rangers never minced words. "Mark's right, Dad," Lisa interjected. "They don't reactivate retired colonels for advisory roles, especially not ones who had a cardiac event during their last deployment." Jim winced. The heart attack in Afghanistan 6 years ago had ended his active duty career, though the Army doctors had assured him it was minor and he had made a full recovery. Still, it had been enough to push him into retirement and teaching at Knox. "This is different," Jim insisted. "They need my specific expertise." "For what?" Sarah asked, her voice tightly controlled. Jim hesitated. "I can't share the details. It's classified." "Of course it is," Sarah said, setting her untouched whiskey down with enough force to slosh some over the rim. "It always is, isn't it, Jim? For 40 years, it's always been classified." "Sarah," Jim began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "No, you listen to me, James Callahan. You promised. When you retired, you promised that was it. No more deployments, no more coming home with pieces missing, physical or otherwise." The room fell silent. Jim looked down at his left hand, unconsciously flexing the two fingers that never quite straightened properly after a shrapnel wound in Iraq. "Dad," Lisa said gently, "you've served your country for decades. You've earned your peace. Whatever this is, there must be someone else who can handle it." "There isn't," Jim replied simply. Mark leaned forward. "Sir, is this something to do with Victor Kane?" Jim's head snapped up. "How do you know that name?" "There are rumors in special ops circles that he's alive, building some kind of attack network." Sarah stood abruptly and walked to the window, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Mark, could you give us a few minutes?" Jim asked quietly. The younger man nodded, standing. "Of course, sir, Lisa." Lisa hesitated, looking between her parents, then reluctantly followed her husband from the room. When they were alone, Jim crossed to where Sarah stood, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. She remained rigid beneath his touch. "Sarah, look at me." Slowly she turned. There were tears in her eyes, but her expression was composed, controlled. The face of a woman who had endured decades of deployments, who had raised a child largely alone, who had waited by the phone too many times. "They need me," Jim said softly. This is something only I can do." "They always need you, Jim. They'll always find a reason why it has to be you." She placed a hand on his chest, just over his heart. "But what about what we need? What about your health?" Dr. Patel said any significant stress could trigger another episode. "I'll be careful." "You've never been careful a day in your life when it comes to duty," she countered, but there was a hint of resigned affection in her tone. Jim took her hand, leading her to the sofa where they sat close together. From the shelf nearby, he took down an old leather-bound photo album. "Remember this?" Sarah nodded. "Our first years together, before Lisa." Jim opened the album to reveal photographs of a much younger version of himself, standing proudly beside an M1 Abrams tank, the wolf emblem clearly visible on its turret. Other photos showed Jim with his crew, Ray, Frank, and others, arms around each other's shoulders, desert sand covering their uniforms. "The Iron Wolves," Sarah murmured. "The finest men I've ever known," Jim confirmed. He turned a page to show a photo of Frank Wilson holding his infant son. Michael was so small. Sarah's expression softened. "How old would he be now?" 32, same as Mark." Jim paused. "He's part of this mission, Sarah, Frank's boy." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "That's why you have to go, not just for whatever this classified threat is, but for Michael. Frank saved my life at 73 Easting. I couldn't save his." Jim's voice grew hoarse. "I've carried that for 30 years. Sarah placed her hand over his. "And you think this will make it right?" No, nothing can make it right, but maybe I can finally do something for Frank's son. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. I need to do this, Sarah. One last mission, I promise. Sarah was silent for a long moment, then stood and walked to a small secretary desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and removed a small box, which she brought back to Jim. I was going to give you this tonight anyway, she said, placing it in his hands. Jim opened the box to find a silver chain with a pendant, a small silver wolf with ruby eyes matching the pin he had left on Frank's grave that morning. Where did you find this? I had it made, from the original design. Sarah took the necklace and fastened it around his neck. So a part of the pack is always with you. Jim felt a lump form in his throat. Sarah, I hate this, she said firmly. I hate that they're taking you away again. I hate that you feel you have to go. She cupped his face in her hands. But I've been a soldier's wife for 35 years, and I know that look in your eyes. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Come home to me, James Callahan. All of you, not just the parts they don't use up. Jim pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I promise. From the doorway, unseen by either of them, Lisa watched her parents with a mixture of worry and pride. Despite her objections, she understood her father in ways even he didn't realize. The need to serve, to protect, ran in the Callahan blood. It was why she had become a trauma surgeon, why she worked in a veterans hospital. It was why, despite her concerns for her father's health, a part of her knew this was something he had to do. As if sensing her thoughts, Mark appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. He'll be okay, Mark whispered. Men like your father don't know how to fail. Lisa leaned into her husband's strength. That's what worries me, she replied softly. He'll complete the mission even if it kills him. In the living room, Jim held his wife close, the wolf pendant cool against his skin, a promise and a reminder. The Iron Wolves were assembling once more, and James Callahan would answer the call, as he always had. But this time, the stakes felt higher than ever before. Chapter 4. The New Tank Team. The sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling expanse of Fort Bliss, Texas, the heat rising in visible waves from the asphalt. Jim stood in the shadow of a massive hangar, watching as the transport plane taxied to a stop on the runway. Despite the digital camouflage uniform he now wore, he felt oddly exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Beside him, Ray Martinez spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. Like old times, Ray remarked, adjusting his master gunner's insignia on his uniform. Except my knees hurt more and you've got less hair. Jim chuckled despite his tension. Speak for yourself. I've still got all mine. Just change the color. Keep telling yourself that, Colonel. Ray nodded toward the plane as its cargo ramp began to lower. That'll be our new toys. The massive C-17 Globemaster had brought not just personnel, but equipment. 2 modified M1A3 Abrams tanks, their desert camouflage gleaming under the Texas sun. They look different, Jim observed, his expert eye immediately spotting the modifications to the main gun and the additional equipment mounted on the turrets. That's the Phoenix package, came a voice from behind them. Jim turned to see a young woman approaching, her uniform bearing the insignia of a chief warrant officer. Asian American, she appeared to be in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes that assessed Jim and Ray with quick precision. Chief Warrant Officer Tiffany Chen, she introduced herself, saluting crisply. Engineering Corps attached to Phoenix Deterrent. I designed the modifications. Jim returned the salute. Colonel James Callahan, this is Master Sergeant Martinez. The Iron Wolves, Chen said, a hint of awe in her voice. I studied your tactics at West Point. The 73 Easting engagement is still taught as a textbook example of perfect tank warfare execution. Jim felt a twinge of discomfort at being treated like a historical relic. That was a long time ago, Chief. What can you tell us about these modifications? Chen's expression shifted immediately to professional enthusiasm. The Phoenix package converts the standard M1A3 Abrams into what we're calling a maritime interdiction platform. The main gun has been recalibrated for extended range engagement of naval targets, with a new fire control system that compensates for target movement across water. She led them toward a hangar where a team of technicians was already preparing to unload the tanks. The standard 120mm smoothbore has been modified to fire a new armor-penetrating, delayed fuse shell specifically designed for maritime targets, Chen continued. We've also upgraded the thermal imaging and targeting systems to function effectively over water, which presents different heat signature challenges than land-based targets. Ray whistled appreciatively. You've been busy, Chief. We had to compress about 2 years of R&D into 6 months, Chen admitted. There are still some performance issues we're working through. What kind of issues? Jim asked sharply. Chen hesitated. Accuracy beyond 3 kilometers is inconsistent. The rounds tend to skip off water at low angles of approach, and the fire control software sometimes loses track of targets moving faster than 40 knots. So basically all the things we need to work in an actual combat situation, Ray summarized dryly. We'll figure it out, Chen insisted. That's why you're here, sir. Your experience with adaptive targeting solutions is unparalleled. Jim was about to respond when the sound of boots on concrete drew their attention. A group of soldiers approached from the direction of the base headquarters, led by a captain whose bearing immediately identified him as a tank commander. Jim felt his heart rate increase. Even at a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. Michael Wilson had his father's build, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same determined set to his jaw. As the group drew closer, Jim could see that Michael had his mother's eyes, a startling blue that had always seemed incongruous with Frank's otherwise rugged appearance. Captain Wilson, Chen called, waving the group over. Michael's stride faltered almost imperceptibly when he recognized Jim, but his professional demeanor remained intact as he led his team to where Jim, Ray, and Chen stood. Colonel, Michael acknowledged with a perfect salute, his expression carefully neutral. Captain Michael Wilson reporting as ordered, sir. Jim returned the salute, searching the younger man's face for any hint of the 4-year-old boy he had last seen clutching his mother's hand at Arlington. Captain Wilson, it's been a long time. Yes, sir. Michael's tone revealed nothing. An awkward silence fell until Ray stepped forward. You probably don't remember me, Captain. Ray Martinez. I served with your father. A flicker of genuine emotion crossed Michael's face. Master Sergeant Martinez, my mother spoke of you often. Said you were the only one who could keep my father in line. Ray laughed. Your old man was too damn brave for his own good. Kind of like someone else I know. He shot a meaningful glance at Jim. Michael ignored the comment, turning instead to introduce his crew. This is my team, First Sergeant Diego Ramirez, gunner. A stocky, Hispanic man in his mid-40s nodded respectfully. His weathered face and the combat patches on his uniform spoke to extensive experience. Sergeant First Class Lisa Chen, no relation to the chief here, loader and communications specialist. A petite but muscular Asian-American woman, perhaps 30, gave a crisp nod. Her expression was focused, serious. And Specialist Tyler Jackson, driver, the youngest of the group, an African-American man who couldn't be more than 22, smiled nervously, clearly somewhat awed to be in the presence of a full colonel. We're the top-scoring Abrams crew in the 3rd Armored, Michael added, a hint of pride breaking through his professional demeanor. That's why you're here, Jim confirmed. This mission requires the best. Michael's expression hardened slightly. With all due respect, sir, we've been given minimal information about this mission. My team deserves to know what they're training for. Jim glanced at Chen, who nodded and produced a tablet from her pack. Let's move this inside, Captain. What I'm about to brief you on is classified top secret. The group relocated to a secure briefing room inside the hangar. Chen connected her tablet to a large display screen while the others took seats around a conference table. Jim remained standing, automatically assuming the position of authority at the head of the table. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room, Jim began, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had led men into battle for decades. 3 weeks ago, U.S. intelligence detected an imminent threat to our naval assets in the Persian Gulf and potentially to coastal facilities on U.S. territory. Chen brought up the same ghostly image of the stealth boat that Eleanor had shown Jim in her office. This is what we're up against, Jim continued. A new class of stealth attack boat that is virtually undetectable by conventional radar and sonar. These vessels can approach to within lethal range of our ships without being detected until it's too late. Michael leaned forward, studying the image with a professional eye. Size estimate? Approximately 60 feet long, displacement around 30 tons, Chen answered. Armed with what we believe are Russian-designed club anti-ship missiles modified for stealth launch, potentially also equipped with torpedoes. Who's operating them? Ramirez asked, his experienced eyes narrowing. Jim hesitated, then decided the team deserved the full truth. A terrorist organization led by a former U.S. Special Forces operator named Victor Cohen. The name didn't seem to register with the younger team members, but Ramirez's head snapped up. The Victor Kane? Desert Storm Delta? I thought he was killed in Afghanistan. So did everyone, Jim confirmed. Intelligence now indicates he survived and has spent the last 15 years building a network dedicated to asymmetric warfare against U.S. interests. Michael's expression remains skeptical. And tanks are the answer to these stealth boats? Not aircraft or naval assets? That's precisely why this approach might work, Captain Jim explained. Kane will have countermeasures for conventional responses. His entire strategy relies on technological superiority against our standard naval defenses. What he won't be expecting is a World War II solution to a 21st century problem. With all due respect, sir, what does World War II have to do with this? Michael asked, his tone bordering on insubordination. Instead of answering directly, Jim turned to Chen. Show them Tobruk. Chen tapped her tablet, and the screen changed to show a black and white photograph of a large coastal gun emplacement overlooking a harbor. German soldiers in desert uniforms stood beside what was clearly an 88mm flak gun. In 1942, German forces at Tobruk used 88mm anti-aircraft guns in a role they were never designed for. Anti-ship warfare, Jim explained, warming to the subject. When British destroyers approached to deploy commandos, these guns engaged and sank HMS Sikh, a vessel many times their size and theoretically out of their effective range. He moved closer to the screen. The Germans adapted a weapon designed for one purpose to serve an entirely different function. And it worked because the British weren't expecting it. They had no countermeasures, no defense against an approach they hadn't anticipated. That's our strategy, Chen added. Modified Abrams tanks positioned at key coastal locations, ready to engage these stealth vessels when they approach U.S. waters. Michael shook his head. Sir, with respect, an Abrams isn't designed for this kind of engagement. The fire control systems, the main gun, even the ammunition, it's all optimized for land warfare against other armored vehicles. Which is why we've modified them, Chen interjected. The Phoenix package adapts the Abrams for precisely this role. Has it been field tested? Michael pressed. Chen and Jim exchanged glances. That's why you're here, Captain, Jim said finally. You and your crew will be the field test. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. It was Ramirez who finally spoke. So we're guinea pigs. You're innovators, Jim corrected. Just like the tank crews who first figured out how to use Shermans against Tigers in Normandy, or the first Abrams commanders who had to develop tactics against T-72s in real time during Desert Storm. He looked at each member of the crew in turn, finally settling his gaze on Michael. This is the kind of challenge that defines careers, Captain. The kind that writes the doctrine future generations will study. Michael held Jim's gaze, unimpressed. Or the kind that gets crews killed unnecessarily. There are no unnecessary deaths in defense of our nation, Captain, Jim replied, his voice hard. The tension in the room was palpable. Ray, sensing the brewing confrontation, intervened. Look, we can debate strategy all day, but right now we've got 2 modified Abrams sitting on that tarmac that need to be checked out. He stood, addressing Michael's crew directly. I've been working Abrams tanks since before most of you were born. Let me show you what these new toys can do. Then you can decide if they are worth betting your lives on. The practical suggestions seemed to diffuse some of the tension. Michael gave a short nod. Fine, let's see what we're working with. As the group filed out of the briefing room, Michael deliberately waited until Jim was passing by to speak in a low voice that only the colonel could hear. My father trusted you with his life. That didn't work out so well for him. Before Jim could respond, Michael had moved past him, following his crew toward the hangar doors. Ray appeared at Jim's side. That went well, he remarked sarcastically. He has every right to his anger, Jim replied quietly. You're not responsible for what happened to Frank. Try telling that to his son. Jim watched Michael's retreating back, seeing in the young captain's rigid posture the same determination that had made Frank Wilson one of the finest tank commanders Jim had ever known. This mission just got a whole lot more complicated, Jim murmured. They always are when it's personal, boss, Ray replied, clapping a hand on Jim's shoulder. Come on, let's go see what kind of Frankenstein tanks they've built for us. As they walked toward the waiting Abrams, Jim felt the weight of the wolf pendant against his chest beneath his uniform. The Iron Wolves were assembling once again, but this time with a member who might well consider Jim an enemy rather than a leader. The mission to stop Victor Kane had just become a battle on 2 fronts, and Jim wasn't sure which would prove more challenging, defeating a ghost from his past or earning the trust of Frank Wilson's son. Chapter 5. History and Forgotten Lessons. The Pentagon's classified archives were housed deep underground, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete filled with mankind's deadliest secrets. Jim sat alone at a small desk, surrounded by stacks of dusty folders bearing faded top-secret stamps, their yellow pages testifying to decades of neglect. He had spent 3 days at Fort Bliss, long enough to determine that the modified Abrams tanks indeed had potential, but required extensive testing and refinement. While Michael's crew began familiarization training with Chief Chen, Jim had requested permission to visit the archives in Washington, searching for historical precedents that might help solve the targeting problems. Eleanor had arranged immediate transport, understanding that Jim's knowledge of military history might provide insights no modern computer simulation could generate. Jim's fingers traced the typewritten heading on a folder. Operation Agreement, Tobruk, 1942. Inside were after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and most valuably, first-hand accounts from German gun crews who had engaged the British destroyer HMS Seek. Gunnery Sergeant Otto Brecht reports achieving first hit at approximately 4,700 meters using modified range tables. Jim read aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the silent archive room. Second round struck ammunition storage, causing catastrophic damage. He pulled another folder from the stack. This one marked Coastal Defense Improvisation, Pacific Theater, 1944-45. Inside were accounts of how American forces had occasionally used tank destroyers and field artillery to engage Japanese vessels attempting to resupply isolated island garrisons. A pattern was emerging in these historical examples, something the modern computer models hadn't accounted for. Jim grabbed a legal pad and began making notes, diagrams, calculations based on the old reports. Hours passed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Jim's coffee grew cold, then was replaced, then grew cold again. His mind was fully engaged now, seeing connections across decades of warfare, identifying principles that transcended specific technologies. Colonel Callahan? Jim looked up to see a young archivist standing hesitantly at the entrance to his alcove. Yes? There's someone here to see you, sir. Says she has information relevant to your research. Jim frowned. His presence here was supposed to be classified. Who is it? Dr. Catherine Wilson, sir, from the Naval Research Laboratory. Jim felt as though he'd been struck. Catherine Wilson, Frank's widow, Michael's mother. Send her in, he said, he said, gathering his composure. A moment later, Catherine appeared in the doorway. At 58, she remained elegant, her once blonde hair now silver, her posture still military straight from her years as an Army scientist. Her blue eyes, the same startling blue she had passed to her son, regarded Jim with an unreadable expression. Hello, Jim, she said simply. Jim stood, uncertain of the proper protocol. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 decades. Catherine, this is unexpected. Eleanor called me, she explained, stepping into the small research space. Said you were looking into historical precedents for the Phoenix Project. Jim's surprise must have shown on his face because Catherine smiled slightly. I have the same security clearance as you do, Jim. Higher, actually. I've been consulting on the ghost hull problem since it first appeared. I didn't know, Jim admitted. There's a lot you don't know. She gestured to the chair opposite his. May I? Of course. They sat across from each other, the small desk between them covered with classified documents from another era, another war. You've seen Michael, Catherine said. Not a question. Jim nodded. He's grown into a fine officer. He hates you, she said matter-of-factly. Jim winced but didn't dispute the assessment. I don't blame him. You should. I've spent years telling him the truth about what happened to his father. That you did everything humanly possible to save Frank. That you nearly died trying to pull him from that burning Humvee. Catherine's voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed with a hint of anger. He chooses to believe a narrative that makes more sense to him. That his father's commanding officer failed him. It's easier than accepting the random cruelty of war, Jim said softly. Yes, Catherine sighed, but that's not why I'm here. She reached into her briefcase and removed a thick folder marked with both top secret and project discontinued stamps. In 1985, the Navy conducted a series of classified tests codenamed Sea Hammer, she explained, sliding the folder toward Jim. They modified M60 Patton tanks with specialized fire control systems and deployed them along the California coast to engage target drones designed to simulate Soviet missile boats. Jim opened the folder, finding test results, photographs, and technical specifications. I've never heard of this. Few people have. The project was shut down for political reasons. The Navy didn't want the Army encroaching on its coastal defense mission. Jim looked up sharply. But it worked? Catherine nodded. Remarkably well. The tanks achieved an 82% hit rate on moving targets at ranges up to 6 kilometers. The problem wasn't technical, it was institutional. Jim began scanning the documents with renewed interest. This could be exactly what we need. The modern fire control systems on the Abrams are exponentially more sophisticated than anything available in 1980. There's more, Catherine said. The chief engineer on Project Seahammer was my father, Admiral James Whitfield. Jim looked up in surprise. Your father developed this? And kept all his original notes and calculations. She produced a small notebook from her briefcase. This isn't in the official record. It's his personal research journal. I found it when I was clearing out his house after he died last year. Jim accepted the notebook reverently. Catherine, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just stop Victor Kane. Her expression hardened. I've read the intelligence. I know what he's planning. If he succeeds, thousands will die. Jim nodded grimly. We're doing everything we can, including putting my son in harm's way, Catherine observed. Again, Michael is the best tank commander in the Army, Jim said. We need him. And he needs this, Catherine replied, tapping the notebook. My father's calculations solved the exact targeting problems you're facing with the Phoenix modifications. Problems I understand Chief Chen has been struggling with. Jim looked at her with newfound appreciation. You've been involved in the Phoenix project all along, haven't you? A ghost of a smile crossed Catherine's face. Who do you think suggested reactivating you? Eleanor may have made the call, but the recommendation came from me. Jim sat back, stunned. Why, after everything that happened? Because I know you, Jim Callahan. I know that you never leave a mission unfinished, never abandon your men. Her voice softened. And because Frank would have wanted it this way, his son and his best friend working together to protect our country. She stood, gathering her briefcase. The notebook is yours. Use it. Save lives. Jim stood as well, feeling overwhelmed by this unexpected gift, this unexpected ally. Catherine, She held up a hand, stopping him. Just promise me one thing, Jim. Anything. Bring my son home safely. Succeed where you couldn't with his father. The words stung, despite the absence of accusation in her tone. I promise, Jim said solemnly. Catherine nodded once, then turned to leave. At the entrance to the alcove, she paused. And Jim, tell Michael the truth, all of it, even the parts that hurt. He deserves that much. Before Jim could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with the ghosts of the past and the tools to possibly save the future. Jim sat heavily, opening Admiral Whitfield's notebook. The precise handwriting reminded him of Catherine's own methodical notes from their time together at Command and General Staff College, before she had met and married Frank, before life had taken them all down unexpected paths. Inside were detailed calculations, observations about ballistics over water, methods for compensating for wave action and target movement that were decades ahead of their time. The Admiral had solved problems no one else had even properly identified yet. Jim pulled out his secure phone and dialed Fort Bliss. Chief Chen, it's Colonel Callahan. I need you to get Captain Wilson and his crew, plus Sergeant Martinez, into a secure briefing room. I'm sending you classified material that's going to change everything. He paused, listening to her response. Yes, I found what we needed. We can make this work. Jim looked down at the notebook and the stack of historical documents surrounding it. Sometimes the past has all the answers we need, we just have to know where to look. As he hung up, Jim felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Iron Wolves had always prevailed by combining experience with innovation, by finding unexpected solutions to impossible problems. With Catherine's unexpected gift in the lessons of history, they might just have a fighting chance against Victor Kane's ghost ships. And perhaps, in the process, Jim might find a way to honor his promise to Frank Wilson. 3 decades delayed, but no less binding. The wolf pendant seemed to grow warm against his chest as Jim gathered the materials he would need. The hunt was on, and this time the Iron Wolves would not fail. Fort Bliss shimmered under the merciless Texas sun as Jim Callahan made his way across the tarmac. 3 days in Washington poring over classified documents had yielded valuable insights. But now it was time to put theory into practice. He carried Admiral Whitfield's notebook like a holy text, its pages dog-eared and marked with sticky notes, new annotations in his own handwriting crowding the margins. The distant thunder of cannon fire guided him to the test range where Michael Wilson's crew had been working with the modified Abrams tanks. As he approached the firing line, Jim paused to observe the scene before announcing his presence. The 2 Phoenix-modified M1A3 Abrams, sat like massive desert predators, their hulls gleaming under the sun. Even from a distance, the modifications were evident. Specialized optical equipment mounted alongside the traditional sights, the main gun slightly different in profile, the turret adorned with additional sensors that gave the familiar silhouette an alien appearance. Michael stood in the commander's hatch of the lead tank, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he surveyed downrange. Behind him, Chief Chen monitored readings on a specialized tablet, occasionally calling out adjustments. Ray Martinez, looking completely at home despite the years since he'd last commanded a tank, directed the 2nd Abrams through a series of positioning maneuvers. Jim watched as Michael gave a command, followed by the loader, Sergeant Chen shouting "up" to indicate a round was chambered. A moment later, the Abrams' main gun belched fire and smoke, the massive vehicle rocking backward with the recoil. Downrange, a target representing a small naval vessel erupted in a shower of splinters and metal. "Hit!" called Ramirez from the gunner's position. Even from a distance, Jim could see Michael's dissatisfaction. The young captain said something to Chief Chen, who nodded grimly and made notes on her tablet. Jim approached as the crew began preparing for another shot. Ray spotted him first, climbing down from the 2nd tank to greet him. "Welcome back to the sandbox, boss," Ray said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Find anything useful in those musty old files?" "More than I expected," Jim replied, holding up the notebook. "How's the training progressing?" Ray's expression told the story before his words did. "We're hitting targets, but not consistently enough for combat application. Anything beyond 4 clicks is a coin toss. And moving targets smaller than a patrol boat are almost impossible to track with the current fire control system." Jim nodded, having expected as much. "Let's talk to the team." They walked together to the lead tank, where Michael was conferring with Chief Chen. The captain's expression hardened when he saw Jim approaching. "Colonel," Michael acknowledged stiffly, "we didn't expect you back until tomorrow." "Found what I needed ahead of schedule," Jim replied, deliberately keeping his tone neutral. "Chief Chen, can you gather everyone for a briefing? I've got information that might solve our targeting problems." 30 minutes later, the entire team had assembled in the air-conditioned sanctuary of the Tactical Operations Center. Maps of coastal areas were spread across tables, and computer simulations ran on multiple screens showing trajectories and impact probabilities for various targeting scenarios. Jim stood before the group, Admiral Whitfield's notebook open on the lectern before him. "For 3 days, I've been researching historical precedents for what we're attempting here," he began. "Not just the German 88s at Tobruk, but American, British, and even Soviet applications of land-based weapons against naval targets." He nodded to Chief Chen, who brought up images from the files Jim had sent ahead. "What I discovered is that our current approach has been fundamentally flawed. We've been trying to adapt modern tank fire control systems to a naval engagement scenario, essentially forcing the technology to do something it wasn't designed for." Michael leaned forward, his professional curiosity temporarily overriding his personal animosity. "So what's the alternative?" "Going back to first principles," Jim replied, tapping the notebook. "This journal belonged to Admiral James Whitfield, who conducted classified tests in 1980 using M60 tanks for coastal defense. His work was brilliant, but shelved for political reasons." Chief Chen, who had been reviewing the material Jim sent ahead, looked up with newfound respect. "These ballistic calculations account for factors we haven't even been modeling. Wave height influence on apparent target position, atmospheric refraction over water versus land, terminal velocity adjustments for shells impacting at water entry angles." "Exactly," Jim confirmed. "But more importantly, Admiral Whitfield recognized that the fundamental challenge isn't technological, it's conceptual. We don't need to turn tanks into ships. We need to make the water behave like land, at least from a targeting perspective." He turned to a specific page in the notebook. The Admiral developed what he called a translation matrix that essentially converts maritime targeting variables into their terrestrial equivalents. "Instead of teaching the fire control computer a whole new domain, we teach it to see ships as if they were land vehicles, just with different movement parameters." For the first time since they'd reunited, Jim saw genuine interest in Michael's expression. "Would that work with modern fire control systems?" Michael asked, addressing Chief Chen. She was already typing rapidly on her tablet. "Theoretically, yes. Our systems are infinitely more sophisticated than what the Admiral had in 1980. If his approach worked then, we could implement it now with far greater precision." She looked up at Jim. "This could be the breakthrough we've been looking for." There's more, Jim said, gesturing to Ray, who distributed copies of additional documents Jim had brought. The Germans at Tobruk developed specific firing techniques for the 88mm guns when engaging ships. They found that traditional anti-tank firing methods were ineffective, but by applying principles from naval gunnery, specifically how battleships engaged other ships, they achieved remarkable accuracy. Ray nodded in agreement. Bracketing. Instead of trying for a perfect first shot, you deliberately create a pattern. One short, one long, then adjust to bring subsequent rounds onto target. That's 19th century artillery tactics, Michael objected. Sometimes old solutions are the best solutions, Jim countered. Modern tank gunnery assumes computer-assisted precision from the first shot. But against these stealth vessels, moving at high speed on water, we need to adapt. The Phoenix targeting system needs to be reprogrammed to think like a naval gunner, not a tank gunner. For the next hour, the team delved into the historical documents in Admiral Whitfield's notes, identifying key principles that could be applied to their current challenge. Chief Chen and her technical team began sketching modifications to the fire control software, while Ray worked with Ramirez to develop new gunnery procedures based on the historical examples. Throughout the discussion, Jim noticed Michael's gradual shift from skepticism to engagement. The young captain's tactical mind was as sharp as his father's had been, quickly grasping concepts and extending them in innovative directions. If we implement these changes, Michael finally asked, what's our timeline for testing? I've secured range access for tomorrow morning, Jim replied. Chief Chen, can your team have the software modifications ready by then? Chen looked up from her tablet, where she'd been furiously making notes. We'll work through the night if necessary, sir. This approach, it makes so much sense I'm embarrassed we didn't think of it ourselves. Don't be, Jim said kindly. Sometimes it takes looking backward to move forward. As the meeting broke up with team members heading off to their respective tasks, Jim noticed Michael lingering behind, examining one of the historical documents with unusual intensity. Something caught your interest, Captain? Jim asked, approaching cautiously. Michael didn't look up immediately. This report from Tobruk, the German gun commander, he mentions making a seemingly impossible shot to hit the destroyer's magazine, causing catastrophic damage. Ernst Mueller, Jim nodded, one of the most decorated artillery officers in the Africa Corps. The shot he describes was at nearly 5 kilometers, well beyond the 88's official effective range against naval targets. But he made it, Michael said, finally looking up at Jim. How? Jim considered his answer carefully, sensing that this moment mattered more than the technical question itself. The report says Mueller had been an artilleryman in the Imperial German Navy during the First World War. When faced with the challenge of hitting ships from shore, he didn't try to reinvent gunnery. He applied what he already knew from a different context. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. Experience over technology. Experience informing technology, Jim corrected gently. Mueller wasn't stuck in the past. He used the most advanced weapon of his day. But he applied principles he'd learned 20 years earlier to solve a problem no one had anticipated. A complex emotion passed across Michael's face, too quickly for Jim to interpret. Without another word, the young captain gathered the documents and walked away, leaving Jim to wonder if any progress had been made in breaching the wall between them. Later that evening, as Jim reviewed firing tables in his quarters, a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. He opened it to find Ray Martinez holding a bottle of bourbon and 2 paper cups. Figured you could use this, Ray said, inviting himself in. Been a long day. Jim smiled wearily, clearing space on the small desk. Not sure if this is allowed on base anymore. What are they going to do, court-martial us? Ray grinned, pouring generous measures into the cups. We're already on the strangest assignment of our careers. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping the bourbon. Finally, Ray spoke. He's coming around, you know. Michael, I doubt it. Don't sell yourself short, Ray insisted. I was watching him today during the briefing. That look in his eyes when you explained the Admiral's calculations. That was respect, Jim. Professional respect, at least. Jim shook his head. Professional respect isn't enough. Not for what we're facing. I need his trust. Trust takes time, Ray said philosophically. But here's something interesting. After you left, he was asking me about you. Jim looked up sharply. What did he want to know? About 73 Easting. About how you commanded the Iron Wolves. About what kind of officer you really were. Ray took another sip. He's trying to reconcile the man his mother described with the villain he's built up in his head all these years. What did you tell him? The truth, Ray said simply, that you were the finest tank commander I ever served with, that you would have traded places with Frank in a heartbeat if you could have, that you nearly died trying to pull him from that burning Humvee. Jim winced at the memory, the searing heat, the ammunition cooking off, the desperate attempt to reach Frank before being physically dragged away by other soldiers. Did he believe you? Maybe, maybe not. Ray shrugged. But seeds need time to grow, boss. We planted one today. Jim hoped his old friend was right. With each passing day, intelligence reports indicated Victor Kane's forces were moving closer to operational readiness. Time was running short, and they needed every advantage they could get, including a unified team without the distraction of personal animosity. One more thing, Ray added, setting down his cup. I did some digging into the tech specs on these Phoenix modifications. There's something familiar about the basic design concept. Jim raised an eyebrow. How so? I could swear I've seen elements of this before, back in the late 80s. There was a classified program, something about extending the Abrams capability beyond traditional anti-armor roles. Jim froze, a sudden realization dawning. Project Longbow, he said quietly. Ray snapped his fingers. That's it. How'd you know? Instead of answering, Jim retrieved his laptop and pulled up a secure file he'd downloaded from the Pentagon archives. He turned the screen toward Ray. Project Longbow, 1987-1991, Jim explained. A classified initiative to develop an all-terrain weapons platform capable of engaging multiple target types, including naval vessels. Primary design engineer, James Callahan Sr., U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Ray stared at the screen in disbelief. Your father designed this? The original concept for what we're now calling Phoenix? Jim nodded slowly, still processing the connection himself. My father died before the project was completed. It was shelved after Desert Storm when defense priorities shifted. I had no idea it was the foundation for what we're doing now. Jesus, Jim, Ray whispered. You were meant for this mission. It's in your blood. Jim wasn't sure what to make of this revelation. His relationship with his father had been complicated. The senior Callahan had been brilliant but distant, more committed to his work than his family. Jim had followed him into the Army, but chosen the combat arms rather than engineering, perhaps as a small act of rebellion. Now, 3 decades later, their paths had converged in a way neither could have anticipated. Does Michael know? Ray asked. About my father's connection to the project? No, no one does, apparently. Jim closed the laptop thoughtfully. Maybe it's time he did. Ray nodded in agreement, finishing his bourbon. Family legacies. Seems like we can never escape them, no matter how hard we try. As Ray left, Jim remained at his desk, staring at the closed laptop. He thought of his father's unfinished work, of Frank's son carrying on his legacy, of his own promise to Sarah to complete this one last mission and come home safely. The wolf pendant seemed heavier against his chest, a reminder of responsibilities past and present. Tomorrow they would test the modified targeting systems. Tomorrow they would learn if history could indeed provide the key to defeating a thoroughly modern threat. Tomorrow, perhaps, Jim would find the courage to tell Michael the whole truth about Frank, about the mission, and now about the unexpected connection between their families that stretched back further than either had realized. The Iron Wolves were assembling their strength. The hunt would soon begin. Chapter 7, Challenge and Breakthrough. Dawn at the Fort Bliss firing range painted the desert in shades of amber and gold, the early light casting long shadows behind the 2 Abrams tanks we'd positioned on the elevated firing platform. Offshore target silhouettes had been positioned at various distances across the sprawling desert floor, arranged to simulate naval vessels approaching a coastline. Jim stood slightly apart from the group, watching as Chief Chen made final adjustments to the fire control systems based on Admiral Whitfield's calculations. Throughout the night, her team had worked feverishly to implement the changes, integrating the historical insights with modern technology. Michael's crew prepared their tank with the precision of longtime teammates, each member focused on their specific tasks. Jim could see their fatigue. They too had been up most of the night reviewing the new gunnery procedures, but their movements remained crisp, professional. Ray approached, handing Jim a steaming cup of coffee. Big day, boss. If this works, we could be deployment ready by the end of the week. And if it doesn't, we're back to square one, Jim replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The weight of command was familiar, but no less heavy for it. Decades might have passed since he'd led men into combat, but the responsibility felt the same. Captain Wilson is ready when you are, sir, Ray reported formally. Jim nodded and walked toward the lead tank, where Michael stood consulting with Ramirez about the new fire solution parameters. The young captain straightened as Jim approached. Colonel, he acknowledged, Chief Chen has completed the fire control modifications. We're prepared to test the new targeting system. Excellent, Jim replied. What's your assessment of the changes? A hint of professional enthusiasm broke through Michael's usually guarded expression. The integration of the Admiral's ballistic calculations is elegant. If it performs as projected, we should see at least a 40% improvement in accuracy beyond 3 kilometers. Jim allowed himself a small smile. That's what we're here to find out. You have command of the range, Captain. Proceed when ready. Michael nodded and climbed onto the tank, dropping into the commander's position with practiced ease. Jim and Ray retreated to the observation post where Chief Chen monitored the technical aspects of the test. First target engagement, stationary vessel simulation at 3,000 meters, Michael's voice announced over the radio. Jim watched through binoculars as the Abrams turret rotated smoothly, the main gun elevating slightly to account for the distance. The fire control system would be integrating Admiral Whitfield's calculations now, treating the simulated ship as if it were a land target with specific conversion factors. Target acquired, Ramirez reported from the gunner's position. Fire solution complete. Fire when ready, Michael commanded. The Abrams main gun erupted with a thunderous boom, the massive vehicle rocking backward with the recoil. Downrange, the target exploded in a shower of debris. Direct hit, Ray exclaimed, not bothering to hide his excitement. Chief Chen was already analyzing the data on her tablet. Perfect shot placement. The round impacted exactly where the targeting system predicted. Over the next hour, Michael's crew engaged targets at increasing distances, testing the limits of the modified system. Each successful hit built confidence, the crew functioning with growing precision as they adapted to the new procedures. Final test target, Michael announced over the radio. Moving target simulation, 5,200 meters, speed approximately 30 knots on variable course. This would be the most challenging scenario, a distant target moving in an unpredictable pattern, precisely the situation they would face when engaging Victor Kane's stealth vessels. Jim lowered his binoculars, tension building in his chest. At this distance, he could barely make out the target, a small remote-controlled boat zigzagging across the far end of the range. Target acquired, Ramirez reported, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Fire solution. Fluctuating. Having difficulty maintaining lock. Chief Chen frowned at her tablet. The prediction algorithm is struggling with the variable course changes. The target's movement pattern is too erratic. Jim considered for a moment, then keyed his radio. Captain Wilson, recommend applying bracketing technique as discussed yesterday. Manual adjustment rather than full computer control. There was a brief pause before Michael responded. Understood, Colonel. Switching to manual fire control override. Then to his gunner, Ramirez, apply bracketing protocol. First round short, second long, then converge. Roger that, Ramirez acknowledged. Firing first ranging shot. Now. The Abrams fired, the shell landing in the water several meters short of the moving target, sending up a spectacular splash. Second ranging shot, firing. Another boom, another splash. This time beyond the target, effectively trapping it between the two impact points. Convergence solution calculated, Ramirez announced with new confidence. Firing for effect. The third shot roared downrange. Through his binoculars, Jim watched the shell arc gracefully through the morning sky, seeming to hang suspended for a moment before plunging toward the distant target. A direct hit. The small boat disappeared in an explosion of water and debris. Spontaneous cheers erupted from the observation post and from the second tank crew. Even Chief Chen pumped her fist in triumph, her usual professional reserve momentarily forgotten. Target destroyed, Michael confirmed over the radio, his voice controlled, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. Confirm effective engagement at 5,200 meters against a radically moving naval target. Jim allowed himself a moment of pride. The historical techniques, combined with modern technology and the skill of Michael's crew, had achieved what many had deemed impossible. Outstanding work, Captain, Jim responded. Have your crew secure the vehicle and assemble for debriefing in 30 minutes. As Jim turned to discuss the results with Chief Chen, Ray pulled him aside, his expression unusually serious. We've got a situation, Ray said quietly, showing Jim his phone. Security breach at the base data center last night. Someone accessed the Phoenix project files. Jim's celebration evaporated instantly. How bad? Bad enough, they got the targeting modifications, performance specs on the tanks, and deployment scenarios. Ray's voice dropped even lower. Jim, they knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't a random hack. Kane, Jim concluded grimly, he has someone on the inside. That would be my assessment, Ray agreed. And if he knows what we're planning, then our advantage is gone, Jim finished the thought. Has General West been notified? Ray nodded. She's initiating a security review. But for now, we keep this between us. If there is an insider, we don't want to tip them off that we know. Jim considered this unwelcome development. The success of the morning's test had been a critical breakthrough. But if Victor Kane now possessed details of their targeting system, he would develop countermeasures. We need to accelerate the timeline, Jim decided. Get the tanks' deployment ready and move them to the coastal positions before Kane can adapt. That's pushing it, Jim. The crews need more training time. They'll train en route. I'll speak to Eleanor about fast-tracking everything. Jim's mind was already racing ahead, assessing options, contingencies, risks. And Ray, let's keep this from Michael's crew for now. They need to focus on mastering the new system. Ray looked uncomfortable. Keeping them in the dark might do more harm than good. Not keeping them in the dark, Jim clarified. Just managing information. They'll know what they need to know when they need to know it. Ray didn't seem entirely convinced, but he nodded his agreement. Your call, boss, always has been. The debriefing session 30 minutes later was a stark contrast to the previous day's tense meeting. Confidence radiated from Michael's crew, their success on the range having validated both the historical approach and their own abilities. The integration of Admiral Whitfield's ballistic calculations with the modern fire control system has exceeded expectations, Chief Chen reported, displaying the test results on the main screen. Hit probability at maximum range increased from 42% to 87% against moving targets. With further refinements, we can likely push that above 90%. Impressive work, Chief, Jim acknowledged. Captain Wilson, your assessment of the system's combat readiness? Michael's response was measured but positive. The targeting system is sound. We need more training time to fully integrate the new procedures, but I believe we could be deployment ready within 2 weeks. You'll have 1 week, Jim announced, drawing surprised looks from around the table. Sir? Michael questioned, clearly caught off guard. Intelligence indicates accelerated activity in the target network, Jim explained, keeping his voice steady. General West has ordered us to compress the timeline. We deploy to coastal positions in 7 days. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were no longer in the testing phase. They were preparing for actual combat against an elusive, dangerous enemy. Chief Chen, continue refining the targeting system based on today's results, Jim continued. Captain Wilson, establish a 24/7 training rotation for both tank crews. I want them proficient with the new procedures under all conditions, day, night, adverse weather. Yes, sir, Michael acknowledged, though Jim could see concern in his eyes. Questions? Jim asked, looking around the table. Ramirez raised a hand. Sir, do we have updated intelligence on the threat vessels? Configurations, weapon systems, operational patterns? A reasonable question that Jim couldn't fully answer without revealing the security breach. Intelligence is gathering that information now, he replied carefully. You'll be briefed as details become available. The answer seemed to satisfy Ramirez, though Jim noticed Michael's slight frown, the captain's tactical mind no doubt sensing the deliberate vagueness of the response. If there's nothing else, let's get to work, Jim concluded. We have a lot to accomplish in very little time. As the team dispersed, Jim caught Michael hesitating at the door, clearly wanting to speak privately. Jim nodded slightly, indicating the captain should stay behind. When they were alone, Michael spoke directly. With respect, sir, something's changed. Yesterday we had a 2-week deployment window. Now suddenly it's 1 week. What aren't you telling us? Jim considered his response carefully. Michael was too smart to be fed a convenient lie, but the full truth might compromise operational security if there truly was a leak. The threat timeline has accelerated, Jim said finally. That's all I can say at this point. Michael studied him, clearly unsatisfied. My crew is risking their lives for this mission, Colonel. They deserve to know what they're facing. And they will, Jim assured him. When I have concrete information I can share, you'll be the first to know. Until then, I need you to trust me. A humorless smile flickered across Michael's face. Trust. That's a loaded word between us, isn't it? Jim felt a familiar ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his old heart condition. Michael, I know you have your reasons for doubting me, But right now, I'm not asking as the man you blame for your father's death. I'm asking as your commanding officer. Michael's expression hardened, but he nodded curtly. Understood, sir. We'll be ready in a week. As the young captain turned to leave, Jim made a split-second decision. There's something else you should know. Michael paused, looking back questioningly. The Phoenix Project, sorry, Jim said. The basic design concept. It was originally developed by my father in the late 1980s. Project Longbow. It was never implemented, but the fundamental approach was his. Surprise registered on Michael's face. Your father was involved in tank design? Army Corps of Engineers. He specialized in weapons adaptation. Jim felt strangely vulnerable sharing this connection. I didn't know about his role until yesterday. It seems our families have been linked in more ways than either of us realized. Michael absorbed this information silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Does that matter now, sir? The question stung more than Jim expected. I thought it might, to you. What matters is completing the mission successfully, Michael replied coolly. Family history doesn't change our current objectives. With that, he turned and left, leaving Jim alone with the uncomfortable recognition that building bridges would take more than shared heritage or professional respect. The shadow of Frank Wilson's death still stretched long between them, an obstacle perhaps no revelation could overcome. Outside the briefing room, Ray was waiting, having anticipated the private conversation. Didn't go well? He asked, reading Jim's expression. He's professional enough to do his job, Jim replied, deflecting the question. That's what matters right now. Ray wasn't fooled. Sure, boss. Whatever you say. As they walked toward the motor pool where the Phoenix tanks were being serviced, Jim's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Eleanor West, marked urgent. New intelligence, Jim told Ray after reading the message. Eleanor's sending a full briefing package, but the summary isn't good. Satellite imagery has identified what appears to be a staging area for Kane's vessels off the coast of Mexico. They're closer to potential targets than we thought. How many vessels? At least 4 confirmed, possibly 6. Jim pocketed the phone grimly. And something else. The vessels appear to have been modified since the last intelligence assessment. New weapon systems mounted on the decks. Ray swore under his breath. He's adapting. He knows we're coming for him. Jim nodded, the weight of command settling more heavily on his shoulders. The security breach had given Victor Kane valuable intelligence about their capabilities, and he was already responding, modifying his attack vessels to counter the Phoenix tanks. It was becoming a deadly chess match between 2 experienced strategic minds, each anticipating the other's moves, each adapting to changing circumstances. But unlike a chess match, the stakes weren't symbolic. They were measured in American lives that would be lost if Kane's attack succeeded. We adapt too, Jim said with quiet determination. If Kane thinks he knows our capabilities, we'll show him something he isn't expecting. What did you have in mind? Jim's eyes narrowed as a plan began forming. Admiral Whitfield's notebook contained more than just targeting calculations. There were concepts for munition modifications, specialized rounds designed specifically for engaging naval targets. He turned to Ray. Find Chief Chen. We need to talk to her about ammunition options. As Ray hurried off, Jim remained still for a moment, staring in the direction of the distant firing range. Out there, Michael and his crew were already beginning their accelerated training regimen, pushing themselves and their equipment to the limits. 1 week to prepare. 1 week to transform tankers into naval hunters. 1 week to overcome decades of institutional inertia and develop tactics for a threat no one had anticipated. And somewhere out there, Victor Kane was preparing his own forces, perhaps already aware of what Jim was planning. The game was afoot, and Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were already playing from behind. Chapter 8, The Spy Game. The secure conference room at Fort Bliss had been transformed into an impromptu intelligence center. Screens displaying satellite imagery and data feeds from various security agencies. Jim stood before the assembled team, having just concluded a briefing on the latest intelligence about Victor Kane's forces. Questions? He asked, surveying the serious faces around the table. Michael spoke first. These modifications to the enemy vessels, specifically the new weapons mounts, how confident is intelligence in their assessment of capabilities? 70% confidence, Jim replied. Based on the size and configuration, they appear to be Russian-designed Kornet anti-tank missile systems, modified for naval use. Ramirez whistled softly. Kornets can penetrate up to 1,200 millimeters of armored steel. Our tanks aren't invulnerable. Which is why positioning and first strike capability are critical, Jim confirmed. We need to detect and engage these vessels beyond their effective firing range. Chief Chen, who had been studying the technical data, looked up with concern. These modifications must have been recently completed. They weren't visible in the intelligence reports from 2 weeks ago. Jim exchanged a quick glance with Ray, both thinking the same thing. The security breach had prompted Kane to accelerate his own preparations. Intelligence suggests Kane has access to sophisticated engineering resources, Jim said carefully. His ability to adapt quickly is one of the reasons this threat is being taken so seriously. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering deployment plans, communication protocols, and contingency scenarios. Throughout, Jim observed Michael carefully. The captain absorbed the information with professional detachment, asking pointed questions about tactical considerations, but avoiding any personal interaction. As the meeting concluded, Jim addressed the entire team. We deploy in 3 days. I want final readiness assessments by tomorrow evening, that's all. The group began to disperse, but Jim noticed Chief Chen lingering, clearly wanting to speak privately. Once they were alone, she approached with evident concern. Colonel, there's something you should know, she said, her voice low. I've detected unusual activity in the project's secure data network. Jim's expression remained neutral, though internally he tensed. What kind of activity? Someone's been accessing the targeting system files repeatedly over the past 48 hours. The access is authorized, they're using valid credentials, but the pattern is strange. Late-night logins, downloading technical specifications, focusing specifically on the ballistic calculation matrices. Have you mentioned this to anyone else? Just to you, sir. I wasn't sure if it warranted a formal security report. Chen hesitated. Colonel, whoever is accessing these files knows exactly what they're looking for. They're going straight to the most critical elements of the targeting system. Jim nodded gravely. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Chief. Don't mention it to anyone else for now. I'll handle it through appropriate channels. After Chen departed, Jim immediately called Eleanor West on the secure line. We have a problem, Ellie. The breach is ongoing, and it's someone with high-level access. Eleanor's response was crisp, professional. I've initiated a counterintelligence operation. A team from Army CID is en route to Fort Bliss, but they're operating covertly. No one outside your immediate circle should know they're there. What's the plan? We feed false information through the compromised channels while tracking access patterns. With luck, we'll identify the source within 24 hours. Jim considered this approach. If we're feeding false data, we need to ensure our actual operations aren't compromised. Already handled, Eleanor assured him. The deployment timeline and locations we discussed in today's official briefing are decoys. Your actual deployment orders will come directly from me outside normal channels. Jim appreciated Eleanor's thoroughness. She had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else, even back in Desert Storm. Keep me informed, he said. And Ellie, be careful who you trust. Always am, Jim. West out. The call ended. Leaving Jim alone with his thoughts. The knowledge that someone on the base, perhaps someone he interacted with daily, was feeding information to Victor Kane gnawed at him. Trust had always been the foundation of military operations. Without it, the entire structure became dangerously unstable. His contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Michael Wilson stood in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. Captain, Jim acknowledged, surprised. Did you need something? Michael entered, closing the door behind him. Sir, I've been reviewing the deployment plans and something doesn't add up. Jim tensed slightly. Go on. The coastal positions designated for our tanks, they're too obvious. Anyone with basic knowledge of coastal defense would anticipate those locations. Michael hesitated. It feels like we're telegraphing our moves. Jim studied the young captain, impressed by his tactical insight, while simultaneously concerned about how to respond. Michael had correctly identified the deliberate weakness in the decoy plan, but Jim couldn't reveal the counterintelligence operation. You have a valid concern, Captain, Jim said carefully. What would you suggest as an alternative? Michael seemed momentarily taken aback by Jim's receptiveness. I would recommend more unconventional positioning, higher elevations where available, integrated with civilian infrastructure for concealment, staggered deployment to create overlapping fields of fire. Jim nodded, genuinely impressed. Good thinking. Draw up an alternative deployment plan by 0800 tomorrow. For my eyes only. Yes, sir. Michael paused, clearly having more on his mind. Sir, there's something else. My crew has been discussing the security protocols around this mission. They've noticed irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Jim asked, maintaining a neutral expression. Information compartmentalization beyond standard procedure. Restricted access to mission planning resources. Unusual communications routing. Michael met Jim's gaze directly. Sir, my men are experienced enough to recognize the signs of a security concern. If there's something we should know, something that might affect our operational readiness or safety. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Jim faced a difficult choice: maintain strict operational security or provide Michael with information that might build the trust necessary for mission success. Close the door, Jim said finally. Michael complied, then stood waiting expectantly. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room, Jim began. Not even your crew can know yet. Is that clear? Yes, sir. We have a security breach. Someone at Fort Bliss is passing information about Phoenix deterrent to Victor Kane. Michael's expression hardened. How long have you known? Several days. Counterintelligence is already working to identify the source. And the deployment plans we discussed today? Decoys, Jim confirmed. The actual deployment will follow a different timeline and utilize different positions. Michael absorbed this information with a thoughtful frown. That's why you've been keeping information compartmentalized. You're not sure who can be trusted. Exactly. A complex emotion passed across Michael's face, including me and my crew. The question struck at the heart of the tension between them. Jim chose his words carefully. I'm telling you now, aren't I? Michael seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty, sir. Your alternative deployment plan might actually be useful, Jim added. If it's good enough, it could become our actual strategy rather than the fallback plan. A hint of pride flickered in Michael's eyes, quickly suppressed. I'll have it ready by morning, sir. As Michael turned to leave, Jim made another split-second decision. Captain, wait. Michael paused at the door. There's something else you should know. Jim took a deep breath. I spoke with your mother recently. She provided Admiral Whitfield's notebook, her father's work. Surprise registered clearly on Michael's face. My mother is involved in this? She's been consulting on the ghost hull technology from the beginning. She was the one who recommended my reactivation for this mission. Michael's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally a guarded curiosity. Why would she do that? You'd have to ask her, Jim replied, but she believed I was the right person for this mission, despite our history. Michael was silent for a long moment, processing this unexpected revelation. My mother never blamed you for what happened to my father, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. She always said you did everything possible to save him. I tried, Jim said softly. God knows I tried. Another silence fell between them, less tense than before but filled with unspoken emotions and memories. I'll have that deployment plan for you in the morning, sir, Michael said finally, retreating to the safety of professional formality. Thank you, Captain. After Michael left, Jim remained alone in the conference room, wondering if any progress had been made in healing the rift between them. The mission came first. It had to, but Jim couldn't ignore the personal dimension of their relationship. Frank Wilson's son was under his command, just as Frank had been 30 years earlier. The parallels were too strong, the sense of responsibility too acute. Jim's phone buzzed with an incoming message from the counterintelligence team. They had narrowed the potential security breach to 3 individuals with high-level access to the Phoenix Project data. One name on the list made Jim's blood run cold: Major Thomas Reed, base security officer and liaison to the Phoenix Project. Victor Reed's younger brother. Jim had known Thomas Reed was stationed at Fort Bliss, but hadn't connected him to the Phoenix Project. The security officer had maintained a low profile, rarely attending briefings, his interaction with the project largely administrative. The connection was too obvious to be coincidence. Victor Kane, born Victor Reed before adopting his operational alias in Special Forces, had placed his brother in the perfect position to monitor the very project designed to counter his attack plans. Jim immediately called Ray, keeping his voice low despite being alone in the secured room. I need you to find Major Thomas Reed, quietly. No confrontation, just locate him. Reed, the security liaison? Ray sounded confused. What's going on, Jim? He's Victor Kane's brother. A moment of stunned silence, then, son of a bitch. I'll find him. Jim ended the call and immediately contacted Eleanor. Ellie, we have confirmation. Major Thomas Reed, base security liaison. He's Victor's brother. We just made the connection ourselves, Eleanor replied grimly. CID is moving to apprehend him now. Tell them to be careful. If he realizes he's been made, he'll warn Victor. Eleanor finished the thought. We're handling it with full operational security, Jim. Stay focused on mission preparation. Understood. Jim headed immediately to the motor pool where the Phoenix tanks were undergoing final modifications before deployment. He needed to ensure everything was proceeding according to schedule, especially now that the security breach had been identified. As he approached the massive hangar housing the vehicles, an explosion ripped through the evening air, the concussive force knocking him to the ground. Alarms blared as smoke billowed from the motor pool. Jim scrambled to his feet, ears ringing, and sprinted toward the disaster. Military police and emergency vehicles were already converging on the scene. Through the smoke, Jim could make out the distinctive silhouette of an Abrams tank, flames licking around its turret. "Michael!" Jim shouted, searching desperately for any sign of the captain or his crew. "Michael!" Emergency personnel attempted to hold him back, but Jim pushed through, his colonel's authority opening a path toward the burning tank. His heart hammered in his chest, a tight pressure building that he ignored through sheer force of will. A figure emerged from the smoke, Specialist Tyler Jackson, Michael's driver, his face blackened with soot but otherwise appearing uninjured. "Colonel!" Jackson called out, stumbling toward Jim. "We're okay, sir. We weren't in the tank when it blew." Relief surged through Jim, momentarily weakening his knees. "Where's Captain Wilson?" "Over there, sir, with the medics." He was inspecting the ammunition storage when he noticed something wrong with the shells, ordered everyone to clear the area just before the explosion. Jim found Michael being treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation. The rest of his crew gathered nearby in similar condition. The captain looked up as Jim approached, his expression grim despite the oxygen mask covering his face. "Sabotage," Michael managed, pulling the mask aside briefly. "Someone replaced the standard rounds with defective shells packed with extra propellant. When exposed to the tank's electrical systems during loading tests, they detonated," Jim finished, surveying the damage to the Phoenix tank. The turret was severely damaged, the main gun bent at an unnatural angle, the fire control systems likely destroyed beyond repair. "What about the second tank?" "Chief Chen is checking it now," Ramirez reported, his uniform singed but his bearings still professional. "We had already transferred most of the specialized ammunition to secure storage after the loading tests." Jim nodded, his mind racing. This had to be Reed's work, a desperate attempt to cripple the Phoenix project before his cover was blown. But why destroy only one tank? The answer came moments later when Chief Chen approached at a run, her expression urgent. "Colonel, the second tank is clear, but we have another problem. The specialized fire control software, the modified version with Admiral Whitfield's calculations, it's gone, completely wiped from the secure servers." Now Jim understood the strategy. Destroy one tank physically, render the other useless by eliminating its targeting capabilities. With both Phoenix tanks neutralized, Victor Kane's attack could proceed without opposition. "Do you have backups?" Jim demanded. Chen nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Yes, but they're the previous version, before we integrated the Admiral's calculations. We'd lose the improved accuracy at extended ranges." "What about your development system? Your personal workstation?" "Wiped as well, sir. Whoever did this was thorough." Jim fought to control his frustration. Years of command experience had taught him that emotions clouded judgment, and clear judgment was what they needed most right now. "The notebook," he said suddenly. "Admiral Whitfield's original calculations. We can rebuild from those." "That would take days, maybe weeks," Chen objected. "We don't have that kind of time." "We have Admiral Whitfield's daughter," Jim countered. "Dr. Catherine Wilson helped her father develop those calculations. If anyone can recreate them quickly, she can." Understanding dawned in Chen's eyes. Michael's mother. "Exactly. Get her on a secure line immediately, and check if the printed copies of the calculations are still in the secure document room." As Chen hurried off to make the arrangements, Jim turned back to Michael, who had removed the oxygen mask despite the medic's protests. "Reed?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. Jim nodded. "Almost certainly. Military police are searching for him now, but my guess is he's already off base." "He nearly killed my crew," Michael said, a dangerous edge to his voice. "But he failed," Jim pointed out, "thanks to your quick thinking." Michael waved off the compliment. "Anyone would have noticed those shells were tampered with." "Not necessarily. It took an experienced eye." Jim looked around at the damage, already calculating next steps. "We need to get the second tank operational with whatever targeting system we can salvage. And we need to deploy earlier than planned, before Kane realizes his sabotage wasn't completely successful." Michael nodded in agreement, then hesitated. Sir, about the alternative deployment plan. It's now our primary plan, Jim decided on the spot. We can't risk using any strategy that Reed might have compromised. For the first time since their reunion, Jim saw something like genuine respect in Michael's eyes. I'll have my crew ready, sir. Whatever it takes. In that moment, with smoke still billowing from the damaged tank and alarms wailing across the base, Jim felt a shift in their relationship. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but something approaching mutual respect forged in the crucible of crisis. The sabotage had been a serious setback, but not a mission killer. They still had one operational Phoenix tank, a crew determined to complete their mission, and the advantage of Michael's alternative deployment strategy that Victor Kane wouldn't be expecting. Most importantly, they now knew definitively who their enemy was and how he had been staying one step ahead of them. That knowledge was power, and Jim intended to use it. As military police and emergency crews swarmed the area, Jim pulled Ray aside. Contact Eleanor. Tell her what happened and that we're accelerating the deployment. We move out at dawn. Ray nodded, his expression grim but determined. The hunt is on. Yes, Jim agreed, watching as Michael organized his crew despite their injuries, already focusing on what needed to be done rather than what had been lost. And this time we're the predators, not the prey. The Iron Wolves were wounded but not defeated. The mission would continue, and Victor Kane would learn a painful lesson. It took more than sabotage to stop a determined tank crew with a score to settle. Chapter 9. Preparing for Battle. Darkness had fallen over Fort Bliss, but the Phoenix team worked tirelessly in the auxiliary motor pool where the surviving tank had been relocated. Under Chief Chen's direction, technicians swarmed over the vehicle, installing replacement components and recalibrating systems. Jim stood slightly apart, speaking quietly into a secure phone. Yes, Catherine. We need those calculations as soon as possible. Catherine Wilson's voice came through clearly, professional and focused despite the late hour. I'm already working on them, Jim. I have my father's original drafts and my own notes from the project. But this isn't something I can reconstruct in a few hours. We don't have a choice, Jim replied grimly. The deployment can't wait. Kane's vessels have been spotted moving north along the Mexican coast. Intelligence estimates they'll be in position to strike within 48 hours. There was a pause before Catherine responded. I can give you a simplified version of the ballistic calculations by morning. It won't have all the refinements of the final system, but it should provide improved accuracy over the standard fire control software. That will have to do, Jim acknowledged. Thank you, Catherine. Jim, she said, her voice softening slightly. How is Michael handling all this? Jim glanced across to the motor pool where Michael was working alongside his crew, helping to load the specialized anti-ship ammunition they had developed based on Admiral Whitfield's concepts. Despite his injuries from the explosion, the young captain had refused medical evacuation, insisting on staying with his tank and his men. He's impressive, Jim admitted. Frank would be proud. Catherine's voice carried a hint of emotion for the first time. His father's son in every way. Take care of him, Jim. I will, Jim promised, though they both knew it was a promise that circumstances might prevent him from keeping. After ending the call, Jim joined Ray near the tank, where his old friend was supervising the installation of additional armor plating around the turret. How's it coming? Jim asked. We'll be operational by dawn, Ray reported. Not pretty, but combat ready. Chen's team is installing the backup targeting system now, and they've left slots for Catherine's calculations to be integrated once they arrive. Jim nodded, surveying the activity around them. And the crew? Ray's expression sobered. Medics wanted to evacuate Ramirez and Chen for smoke inhalation treatment, but they refused. Jackson's got second-degree burns on his hands but won't leave his post. They're a tough bunch, Jim. Reminds me of us back in the day. The Iron Wolves always were too stubborn to know when to quit, Jim said with a hint of pride. Speaking of stubborn, Ray continued, lowering his voice, Michael's been pushing himself beyond his limits. You might want to talk to him before he collapses. Jim frowned, observing Michael more closely. Now that Ray mentioned it, he could see the signs of exhaustion and pain the young captain was trying to hide. The stiffness in his movements. The occasional wince when he thought no one was watching. I'll handle it, Jim assured Ray, then made his way toward Michael. As he approached, Michael straightened automatically, his posture betraying no weakness despite the bandages visible beneath his sleeve. Colonel, he acknowledged. Walk with me, Captain, Jim said, making it an order rather than a request. Michael hesitated, glancing at his crew, then reluctantly fell into step beside Jim as they moved away from the busy motor pool. Your crew has the situation well in hand, Jim said once they were out of earshot. You need rest if you're going to be effective tomorrow. Michael's jaw tightened. I'm fine, sir. No, you're not, Jim countered evenly, and pretending otherwise isn't helping anyone, especially your team. They take their cues from you, Captain. If you push until you break, they'll do the same. For a moment, Michael looked ready to argue, but then his shoulders slumped slightly, the facade of invulnerability cracking. The medic says I have 3 cracked ribs and moderate smoke inhalation damage. And you're still on your feet because this mission matters, Michael replied with quiet intensity. Because Reed tried to kill my crew. Because if we fail, Kane succeeds, and American lives are lost. Jim studied the younger man thoughtfully. All true, but you won't complete this mission if you collapse from exhaustion before we even deploy. Michael seemed about to protest further when a coughing fit seized him, painful and prolonged. Jim waited patiently until it subsided. 4 hours, Jim said when Michael could breathe normally again. Get 4 hours of rest while Chen's team finishes the modifications. That's an order, Captain. Michael looked as though he wanted to object, but finally nodded in reluctant acceptance. 4 hours, then I'm back with my crew. Agreed. As Michael turned to leave, Jim added, and Michael, what you did today, recognizing the sabotaged ammunition and clearing your crew before the explosion, that was exceptional leadership. Michael paused, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. I was just doing my job, sir. So was your father when he saved my life at 73 Easting, Jim replied quietly. Excellence isn't just doing your job, it's doing it when it matters most, when lives hang in the balance. Something shifted in Michael's expression. Not quite warmth, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Without another word, he continued toward the temporary quarters that had been established near the motor pool. Jim returned to the tank where Chief Chen was emerging from the commander's hatch after installing components in the fire control system. How's it looking, Chief? He asked. We'll be ready to roll at dawn, she confirmed, wiping grease from her hands. The backup targeting system is installed and functional. It's not as accurate as the sabotaged version, but it's operational. Once we receive Dr. Wilson's calculations, we can upload them through this interface. She indicated a specialized port they had installed in the fire control computer. Good work, Jim acknowledged. And the ammunition? 20 specialized anti-ship rounds ready for loading, plus standard ammunition as backup. The new rounds incorporate Admiral Whitfield's concept of delayed detonation beneath the waterline for maximum damage to ship hulls. Jim nodded, impressed once again by the team's ability to adapt under pressure. What Reed's sabotage had meant to cripple, their ingenuity and determination had restored. Get some rest, Chief, Jim advised. Tomorrow will be a long day. As the night progressed, Jim found himself unable to sleep despite his own exhaustion. Instead, he reviewed the latest intelligence reports, satellite imagery of Kane's vessels, and weather forecasts for the deployment route and coastal positions. Around 3 a.m., his secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. Catherine Wilson had completed the simplified ballistic calculations ahead of schedule and was transmitting them now. Jim immediately alerted Chief Chen, who had been sleeping on a cot near the tank, ready to respond to any technical emergencies. These look good, Chen confirmed after reviewing the data. Not as comprehensive as the original system, but definitely an improvement over the standard Abrams targeting software. I'll start the integration immediately. By the time dawn broke over the desert, the Phoenix tank stood ready for deployment. Its desert camouflage had been hastily repainted in a coastal pattern, its systems checked and rechecked, its specialized ammunition loaded and secured. The crew assembled before the vehicle, looking tired but determined despite their injuries. Michael, having gotten his promised 4 hours of rest, appeared steadier on his feet, though Jim could still see the signs of pain he was working to conceal. Eleanor West arrived personally to oversee the deployment, her staff car pulling up beside the motor pool as the morning light strengthened. Impressive work, she acknowledged, after inspecting the modified tank and reviewing the mission preparations, especially considering yesterday's setback. We're combat ready, General, Jim confirmed. Dr. Wilson's calculations have been integrated into the targeting system, and the crew is prepared for immediate deployment. Eleanor nodded, then gestured for Jim to join her a short distance away from the others. Her expression grew serious as they stepped out of earshot. Reed was captured, attempting to cross into Mexico last night, she informed him. Under interrogation, he revealed that Victor has accelerated his timeline. The attack is planned for tomorrow night, targeting Naval Station San Diego. Jim's expression hardened. Then we deploy immediately. Air transport is standing by to fly the tank to Camp Pendleton, Eleanor confirmed. From there, you'll move to pre-selected coastal positions according to Captain Wilson's alternative deployment plan. She handed Jim a sealed envelope. These are your final orders, authentication codes, and emergency protocols. Once you deploy, you'll be operating with minimal support due to operational security concerns. Victor has penetrated our communications networks more extensively than we initially believed. Jim accepted the envelope, understanding the implications. We're on our own. Not entirely, Eleanor corrected. Navy SEAL Team 4 will be on standby offshore, and coastal radar installations have been updated with signatures for the ghost vessels. But primary interception responsibility falls to Phoenix. Jim nodded grimly. We won't fail, Ellie. Eleanor's professional demeanor softened slightly. I know you won't, Jim. That's why I recommended your reactivation for this mission. No one understands adaptive warfare better than you do. She glanced toward Michael and his crew, who were making final preparations by the tank. And no one commands loyalty the way you do. Those young soldiers would follow you into hell if you asked them to. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Jim replied, though both of them knew the risks they were facing. Eleanor extended her hand formally. Good hunting, Colonel. Jim shook it firmly. Thank you, General. As Eleanor departed, Jim rejoined the Phoenix team, who had gathered around the tank for a final briefing before deployment. Our timeline has accelerated, Jim announced. Intelligence confirms that Kane's vessels are moving to attack position earlier than expected. We deploy immediately to California, where we'll take up coastal defensive positions according to Captain Wilson's plan. He looked at each member of the team in turn, meeting their eyes. I won't sugarcoat this. We're facing a determined enemy with technological advantages and inside information about our capabilities. The odds are not in our favor. Odds are for people who don't know what they're doing, Ray interjected with a grim smile. We know exactly what we're doing. A few nervous chuckles broke the tension. One operational tank against multiple stealth vessels is not the scenario any of us would have chosen, Jim continued. But throughout military history, battles have been won not by superior numbers or even superior technology, but by adaptability, courage, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to complete the mission. He rested a hand on the tank's hull, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. This vehicle represents the culmination of decades of military innovation, from the 88 medium guns at Tobruk to Admiral Whitfield's ballistic calculations to Chief Chen's modern adaptations. But it's just steel and circuits without the human element, without your skill, your courage, your determination. Jim's gaze settled on Michael, seeing in the young captain's steady eyes the same resolve he had once seen in Frank Wilson's. Iron wolves hunt as a pack, even when there's only one of us. Today we write a new chapter in the history of adaptive warfare. Today we prove that American ingenuity can overcome any threat, no matter how advanced. Michael stepped forward, standing tall despite his injuries. Phoenix is ready, Colonel. We won't let Kane reach his targets. Jim nodded in acknowledgement, feeling a surge of pride in this crew that had overcome sabotage, injuries, and compressed timelines to stand ready for combat. Mount up, he ordered. It's time to hunt. As the crew climbed aboard the tank and the massive vehicle rumbled to life, Jim felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders. 30 years had passed since he had led men into combat, but the responsibility remained the same, to bring them home safely while accomplishing the mission. The tank moved forward, heading toward the waiting transport aircraft, its tracks leaving deep imprints in the desert soil of Fort Bliss. Somewhere along the California coast, Victor Kane's ghost ships were approaching, their stealth technology making them nearly invisible to conventional defenses. But the Iron Wolves had found ways to see the invisible before. They would do so again. The hunt was on, and Jim Callahan intended to finish what had begun 30 years ago in the deserts of Iraq, to protect his nation, to honor the memory of Frank Wilson, and perhaps finally to find peace with the son who had grown up without a father. As the transport aircraft's ramp lowered to receive the Phoenix tank, Jim touched the wolf pendant beneath his uniform and whispered words only he could hear. Once more into the breach, old friend. Once more for the pack. The California coastline appeared below as the massive C-17 transport plane began its descent toward Camp Pendleton. Inside the cavernous cargo hold, Jim Callahan sat beside the Phoenix tank, reviewing coastal maps one final time. The aircraft vibrated with turbulence, but Jim barely noticed, his focus entirely on the mission ahead. Ray Martinez approached, holding out a satellite phone. Eleanor on secure line, boss. Jim took the phone, pressing it to his ear as he moved toward a quieter corner of the cargo bay. Callahan here. Jim, we have confirmation. Eleanor's voice came through clearly despite the encryption. 4 ghost vessels moving north along the coast, approximately 60 miles south of San Diego. Current speed 15 knots, maintaining stealth configuration. Estimated time to target? If they maintain current course and speed, they'll be within strike range of Naval Station San Diego by over 200 hours. That gives you just under 12 hours to deploy and prepare. Jim checked his watch. We'll be ready. Any update on Victor's personal location? Negative. Intelligence believes he may be coordinating remotely, but we can't confirm. Reed continues to insist his brother will be commanding from the lead vessel. But you don't believe him, Jim observed. I believe Victor is too smart to place himself in direct danger unless absolutely necessary. Eleanor's voice hardened slightly. Jim, listen carefully. The Joint Chiefs have authorized naval aviation and SEAL deployment as backup, but only if Phoenix fails to intercept. The president wants this handled as quietly as possible to avoid public panic. Understood. One more thing. Catherine Wilson has sent additional targeting adjustments. They'll be waiting at Camp Pendleton. Her message said you'd understand their significance. Jim felt a flicker of hope. Catherine's expertise in ballistics might provide the edge they needed. Copy that? Anything else? Just come back alive, Jim. All of you. The professional distance in Eleanor's voice slipped momentarily, revealing the concern of an old friend. We'll do our best, Ellie. The call ended as the aircraft began its final approach. Jim rejoined Ray near the tank, where Michael and his crew were already preparing for the offload, checking equipment and running final systems diagnostics. Victor's vessels are on the move, Jim informed them quietly. We'll have approximately 12 hours to deploy and prepare. Michael nodded, his expression betraying no anxiety despite the pressure. The coastal position I selected gives us clear sight lines for 8 miles in all directions and elevation advantage. If they approach within that radius, we'll see them, stealth technology or not. Jim studied the young captain with grudging admiration. Despite his injuries and the enormity of the responsibility, Michael remained focused, professional. In that moment, the resemblance to his father was uncanny. The aircraft touched down with a series of jolts, taxiing to a remote hangar area of Camp Pendleton, where a small contingent of Marines waited to provide security and logistical support. As the rear cargo ramp lowered, Jim felt the cool Pacific air rush in, a stark contrast to the dry heat of Fort Bliss. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The Phoenix tank was offloaded, final modifications were completed, and Catherine Wilson's additional targeting calculations were integrated into the fire control system. By late afternoon, they were ready to move to their deployment position along the coastline. As sunset approached, Jim found Michael sitting alone on a supply crate, staring out at the Pacific Ocean visible in the distance. The young captain seemed lost in thought, his usual stern expression replaced by something more contemplative. Jim hesitated, then approached. Mind if I join you? Michael glanced up, momentarily surprised, then shrugged. It's a free country, sir. Jim sat on an adjacent crate, following Michael's gaze toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to sink toward the water. For a while, neither spoke, sharing an unexpectedly comfortable silence. My father used to tell me about the sunsets in Saudi Arabia, Michael said finally, his voice quiet. Said they were unlike anything he'd ever seen. The sky on fire, he called it. Jim nodded, memories flooding back. He was right. Sometimes during Desert Shield, before the fighting started, we'd all stop whatever we were doing just to watch the sun go down over the desert. Your father always made sure to get the best vantage point, even if it meant climbing on top of the tank. A ghost of a smile crossed Michael's face. Sounds like him. Mom says he was always climbing things as a kid, trying to see farther than anyone else. He never lost that, Jim agreed. In battle, that instinct saved our lives more than once. He could see what others missed. Michael's expression grew more serious, like you did with the sabotaged ammunition. I had years of experience to draw on, Jim said modestly. Your instincts were what mattered. You recognized the danger and acted immediately. Michael seemed to consider this, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something small that glinted in the fading light. My mother gave me this before I shipped out for my first deployment, said it belonged to my father. He held out his palm, revealing a small silver pin in the shape of a wolf's head with ruby eyes identical to the one Jim wore on the chain around his neck. The Iron Wolves, Jim said softly. Frank was so proud to wear that pin. We all were. My mother said he never took it off, even after you all returned from Desert Storm. Jim nodded, touched by the revelation. The pack stays together even when separated. Michael closed his hand around the pin, his expression unreadable. Tomorrow we find out if that's still true. Before Jim could respond, Ray approached at a brisk pace. Boss, final deployment orders just came through. We move out in 30 minutes. Jim stood, the moment of connection with Michael broken but not forgotten. Gather the team for final briefing. I want everyone clear on their responsibilities when we reach the coastal position. As Ray departed, Jim turned back to Michael, who had also risen and was pocketing the wolf pin. Captain, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that serving with you has been an honor. Your father would be proud of the officer you've become. Michael met Jim's gaze directly, something new in his eyes. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Thank you, sir. Let's make sure his legacy continues after tomorrow. Jim nodded, feeling the weight of the pendant against his chest. The Iron Wolves hunt one more time. 30 minutes later, under the cover of darkness, the Phoenix tank and its support vehicles departed Camp Pendleton, heading north along a carefully planned route that would keep them hidden from coastal observation. Their destination, a concealed position in the hills overlooking the approach to San Diego Bay, where Victor Kane's ghost vessels would have to pass to reach their targets. The hunt was about to begin, and Jim Callahan was determined that this time the wolves would not return empty-handed. Chapter 12, The Storm Rages. Midnight found the Phoenix team entrenched in their chosen position, a natural depression in the coastal hills that provided both concealment and an unobstructed view of the ocean approaches. The tank sat partially concealed by camouflage netting, its main gun pointed toward the dark waters below. Inside the cramped confines of the Abrams, Michael and his crew maintained a vigilant watch, monitoring the sophisticated detection equipment that represented their best hope of spotting Kane's ghost vessels before they came within striking range of the naval base. Jim stood outside with Ray, both men using night vision equipment to scan the horizon. The night was overcast, a light drizzle beginning to fall as a storm system approached from the west. Weather's deteriorating, Ray observed. Visibility's going to be compromised. Jim nodded grimly. Victor would have planned it this way. The storm provides additional cover for his approach. Makes our job that much harder, Ray agreed, lowering his binoculars. Radar and thermal imaging will be affected by the precipitation and wave action, which is why we're not relying solely on technology. Jim tapped his ear, where a specialized audio pickup was positioned. Sometimes the old ways work best. Ray smiled in understanding. Like World War II submarine hunters, listening for engine sounds. Exactly. Kane's vessels may be visually stealthy and radar-resistant, but they still displace water and make noise. We just need to train ourselves to detect what the instruments might miss. They continued their vigil as the storm intensified, the drizzle becoming steady rain that reduced visibility and dampened sounds. Jim's thoughts turned to Sarah, waiting at home for word of his safety, and to Lisa, who had voiced such strong objections to his return to active duty. He had made promises to both of them, promises that now hung in the balance of the coming confrontation. Shortly after 100 hours, Michael emerged from the tank, his expression tense. Sir, we're picking up anomalous readings on the thermal imaging system. Intermittent heat signatures approximately 6 miles offshore, moving slowly northward. Jim immediately focused his night vision equipment in the indicated direction, but the rain and darkness revealed nothing to visual observation. Multiple signatures? 3 distinct readings, possibly 4. They're maintaining tight formation, which is making individual identification difficult. Jim considered this information. They're earlier than expected. Either their transit speed was faster than intelligence estimated, or they departed sooner. Either way, they're here, Ray interjected, and heading straight for San Diego Bay. Jim made a quick decision. Captain Wilson, prepare your crew for engagement. Based on their current course and speed, they'll be within our effective firing range in approximately 30 minutes. Michael nodded and disappeared back inside the tank to prepare his crew. Jim turned to Ray, his expression grave. This is it, old friend, the culmination of everything we've worked for. Ray clapped a hand on Jim's shoulder. Just like old times, boss, the Iron Wolves on the hunt. Jim smiled briefly, then his expression became serious again. Get inside the tank. I want your expertise on the targeting system when those vessels come into range. As Ray climbed aboard the Abrams, Jim took a final moment alone, staring out at the dark ocean where Victor Kane's ghost vessels were approaching. The rain had intensified, now coming down in sheets that limited visibility to mere yards. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting soundtrack for the battle to come. Jim touched the wolf pendant beneath his rain-soaked uniform. "Watch over us, Frank," he whispered. "Your son is about to face the fight of his life." Inside the Phoenix tank, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Michael occupied the commander's position, Ramirez at the gunner station, Sergeant Chen as loader, and Specialist Jackson in the driver's compartment. Ray positioned himself behind Ramirez, ready to assist with the targeting system when the engagement began. Jim entered hull last, closing the hatch against the driving rain and taking a position where he could observe without interfering with the crew's operations. The interior was cramped, humid with the breath and body heat of 6 people, and thrumming with the power of the idling engine. "Status report," Michael ordered, his voice steady and professional. "Engine at optimal temperature. All systems green," Jackson reported from the driver's position. "Ammunition ready. 20 specialized anti-ship rounds loaded in primary position," Chen confirmed. "Targeting system online. Catherine Wilson's calculations integrated and functioning," Ramirez added from the gunner's station. "Thermal imaging still tracking multiple signatures approximately 5 miles out and closing." Michael nodded, then glanced at Jim. "Colonel, any final instructions before we engage?" Jim considered for a moment before responding. "Trust your training and trust each other. Victor Kane believes he has the advantage of stealth and surprise. Our job is to prove him wrong." The crew nodded in acknowledgement, their expressions serious but determined. "I have something to add," Ray spoke up unexpectedly. From his pocket, he withdrew several small objects that glinted in the dim interior lighting of the tank. Wolf pins, identical to the ones Jim and Michael carried. "I had these made before we left Fort Bliss. Figured if we're hunting as the Iron Wolves, everyone should wear the emblem." He handed the pins to Ramirez, Chen, and Jackson, who accepted them with surprised but appreciative expressions. "The pack hunts together," Ray said simply. A moment of solidarity passed through the cramped compartment. 6 individuals temporarily united as one team with a single purpose. Jim felt a surge of pride in this improvised crew that had overcome sabotage, compressed timelines, and personal differences to arrive at this moment. The moment was interrupted by an urgent beeping from the thermal imaging system. Ramirez immediately focused on his display. "Contact. 3 vessels. Formation Delta, 4,000 meters and closing. Speed increased to approximately 30 knots. They're making their run," Jim observed. "No more need for stealth now that they're approaching their target." Michael made a quick decision. "Jackson, move us to firing position Alpha. Ramirez, prepare to engage lead vessel once in optimal firing range. Chen, ready first anti-ship round." The tank rumbled forward, emerging from its concealed position to take up a more exposed but advantageous firing location atop a small rise. The main gun elevated slightly, tracking the approaching threats despite their virtual invisibility to normal sight. "Range 3,800 meters, Ramirez reported. "Still outside optimal engagement distance. Hold fire until 3,000 meters, Michael ordered. "We want the first shot to count." Tension mounted inside the tank as the distance closed. Jim watched the crew work with seamless coordination. Each member focused entirely on their specific responsibilities. Michael, despite his youth, commanded with a confidence that reminded Jim powerfully of Frank. "Range 3,200 meters, Ramirez announced. "Targets maintaining Formation Delta on direct approach to San Diego Bay." "Target lead vessel," Michael instructed. "Prepare bracketing procedure as rehearsed." "Target acquired," Ramirez confirmed, his hands steady on the controls. "Firing solution calculated with Wilson adjustments, ready to fire on your command." "Range 3,000 meters, Chen reported from her monitoring position. Michael took a deep breath. "Fire." The tank rocked backward as the main gun fired, the sound deafening even inside the armored compartment. Through the gunner's optics, they watched the specialized anti-ship round arc through the rainy night, trailing a faint phosphorescent trace. "Shot away," Ramirez reported. "Impact in 5 seconds." The crew held their breath collectively, watching the thermal display for results. A bright flash bloomed on the screen, followed by Ramirez's triumphant announcement. "Hit! Direct impact on lead vessel." A cheer started to rise but was cut short by Michael's tense command. "Damage assessment." Ramirez studied the thermal image. "Inconclusive. Target is still moving, but has reduced speed. Possible damage to forward section." "Not good enough," Jim commented. "These vessels are designed to absorb damage. We need a kill shot." Michael nodded in agreement. "Ramirez, adjust fire solution. Target the same vessel. Aim for midships where the engine compartment should be located." "Adjusting," Ramirez confirmed, making precise changes to the targeting parameters. "Ready." Fire, Michael ordered. Again, the tank rocked with the recoil of the main gun. This time, the result was more definitive. Direct hit, Ramirez exclaimed. Target vessel has stopped moving. Thermal signature indicates catastrophic damage. One down, Ray commented grimly. But their success had consequences. The remaining vessels suddenly changed course, separating and increasing speed. They've spotted us, Jim observed. They're implementing evasive maneuvers. And something else, Ramirez added, concern in his voice. I'm detecting multiple smaller heat signatures launching from the vessels, probable missile launches. Incoming, Michael shouted. Jackson, evasive action. Everyone brace. The tank lurched into motion, narrowly avoiding the first missile as it struck the ground where they had been positioned moments before. The explosion rocked the vehicle violently, but Jackson's skilled driving kept them moving, presenting a more difficult target for subsequent attacks. They're using the Cornet anti-tank missiles, Jim observed grimly, just as intelligence predicted. We need to keep moving, Michael ordered. Jackson, implement evasion pattern. Bravo, Ramirez, maintain targeting solution on the nearest vessel. Chen, load another anti-ship round. The tank continued its desperate dance, maneuvering across the hillside while attempting to maintain a firing position against the ghost vessels. Two more missiles streaked toward them, one missing entirely and the other detonating close enough to shower the tank with debris, but causing no significant damage. Range to nearest target, Michael demanded. 2,800 meters, bearing 045, Ramirez reported. I have a solid targeting solution. Fire when ready. Ramirez took careful aim, compensating for the tank's movement in the target's evasive course, then fired. The round flew true, striking the second ghost vessel amidships. Hit, Ramirez confirmed. Target is losing speed and turning erratically. Finish it, Michael ordered. One more round. The second shot completed the job, the vessel erupting in a fireball visible even through the rain and darkness. Two down, Ray announced, but his satisfaction was short-lived. The third vessel is changing course, Ramirez reported urgently. It's moving away from San Diego, heading south at maximum speed. Retreating? Chen asked hopefully. Jim shook his head, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. No, Victor wouldn't retreat after coming this far. He studied the thermal image carefully, noting the vessel's specific course. He's not retreating. He's implementing a backup plan. Understanding dawned on Michael's face. San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. It's approximately 40 miles south of our position. That's his alternate target, Jim confirmed grimly. And it makes perfect sense. An attack on the naval station would be damaging, but an attack on a nuclear facility would be catastrophic, Michael finished. Thousands of casualties, massive environmental contamination, widespread panic. Can we pursue? Ray asked. Michael shook his head. Not fast enough. That vessel is moving at least 50 knots. We'd never catch it, even on the coastal highway. Jim made a swift decision. Contact SEAL Team 4. They're on standby offshore. They can intercept before the vessel reaches San Onofre. As Michael relayed the urgent communication, Jim studied the thermal image of the retreating vessel. Something about its movement pattern troubled him. It's maintaining a predictable course, he observed. No evasive maneuvers despite knowing we've destroyed two of its companions. Maybe the pilot is panicking, Ray suggested. Victor Kane doesn't panic, Jim countered, and his people are too well trained for that. A terrible suspicion formed in his mind. It's too convenient. The easy detection, the straightforward engagement, and now a single vessel making an obvious run for a secondary target. You think it's a trap, Michael stated, grasping Jim's concern. I think Victor is too smart to put all his resources into a single approach. Jim pointed to the thermal display. That vessel is a decoy, drawing our attention and our available naval resources south. Michael's expression darkened with realization, while the actual attack comes from another direction entirely. Jim nodded grimly. We need to widen our search perimeter immediately. The crew quickly expanded their sensor sweep, searching in all directions for additional threats. For several tense minutes, nothing appeared on their screens. Then Ramirez spotted it. New contact, bearing 330, range 2,000 meters. Small vessel, minimal heat signature approaching from the northwest. That's not possible, Chen objected. We've been monitoring that sector continuously. It was hiding behind the storm front, Jim realized, using the weather as additional cover while we focused on the southern approach. The new vessel was moving rapidly towards San Diego Bay, its course taking it well away from their current position. It's outside our effective firing arc, Ramirez reported tensely. We need to reposition immediately to engage. Jackson, maximum speed, intercept course, Michael ordered. Everyone hold on. The tank lurched forward, engines roaring as it began a rapid descent from the hillside position toward the coastal highway that would allow them to establish a new firing position. SEAL Team 4 is engaging the southern vessel, Chen reported from the communication station, but they're at least 10 minutes from intercepting. We're on our own with this one, Jim confirmed, just as Victor planned. The tank raced along the highway, pushing to its maximum speed in a desperate attempt to reach a position where they could engage the northwestern vessel before it reached the harbor. Rain lashed against the exterior, reducing visibility to near zero for anyone not using specialized equipment. Target continuing approach to San Diego Bay, Ramirez reported. Estimated time to weapons range of naval station, 6 minutes. ETA to our firing position, Michael demanded. 4 minutes if we maintain current speed, Jackson replied from the driver's station. Push it faster, Michael ordered. We need to be in position with time to establish a targeting solution. The tank strained forward, its turbine engine howling with effort. Jim gripped a handhold as they bounced over the uneven terrain, his mind racing through possible scenarios and counter strategies. There's something else, Jim said suddenly, a realization striking him. The northwestern vessel. It's smaller than the others, isn't it? Ramirez checked the thermal profile. Affirmative. Approximately 2/3 the size of the vessels we engaged earlier. It's his command vessel, Jim concluded with certainty. Victor always preferred a smaller, faster craft for his own use. During his Delta Force days, he insisted on commanding from the smallest, most maneuverable vehicle available. You think he's on board? Michael asked, understanding the implications. I'd stake my life on it, Jim confirmed. This was his plan all along. Send the decoy vessels as a diversion, then make the actual attack himself from an unexpected direction. A new determination settled over the crew. They weren't just stopping an attack now, they were directly confronting the mastermind behind it. 2 minutes to firing position, Jackson announced as the tank roared along the coastal highway. Target continuing approach, Ramirez reported. Range to San Diego Harbor entrance now 4,000 meters. We'll have one chance at this, Jim warned. Given the size of the vessel and Victor's skill, hitting it will be significantly more difficult than the larger ships. We'll hit it, Michael stated with quiet confidence. Ramirez is the best gunner in the armored division. The tank finally reached its designated firing position, a small promontory overlooking the northern approach to the harbor. Jackson brought the vehicle to a halt, positioning it for optimal firing stability. Target acquired, Ramirez announced. Range 3,500 meters, moving erratically at high speed. Implement Admiral Whitfield's wave motion compensation algorithm, Michael instructed, and prepare for manual adjustment if necessary. Ready? Ramirez confirmed, his concentration absolute as he adjusted the targeting parameters. Fire when you have a solution, Michael ordered, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure. Ramirez worked the controls with precision, tracking the small, fast-moving vessel through the rain and darkness. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as the ghost ship continued its approach to the harbor. I have a solution, Ramirez finally announced. Firing. The main gun roared, sending its specialized anti-ship round arcing toward the distant target. Through the thermal imaging system, they watched anxiously for the result. Miss, Ramirez reported tensely. Target took evasive action at the last second, adjusting for second shot. He saw it coming, Jim muttered. He's anticipating our targeting approach. Range now 3,000 meters, Chen reported. Target continuing toward harbor entrance. Implementing modified targeting solution, Ramirez announced, making rapid adjustments. Ready to fire. Wait, Jim interjected suddenly. He's anticipating our standard approach. We need to do something unexpected. He turned to Michael. Captain, do you remember what I told you about Ernst Muller at Tobruk? Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. The seemingly impossible shot. He didn't aim at where the ship was. He aimed at where it would be, accounting for both its movement and the movement of the water. Exactly, Jim confirmed. We need to think like Mueller did, combine modern technology with intuitive understanding of the target's behavior. Michael nodded decisively. Ramirez, disregard the computer's firing solution. We're going manual on this one. Ramirez looked surprised but quickly shifted to the manual targeting controls. Ready, sir? Michael studied the thermal image intensely, watching the pattern of the small vessel's evasive maneuvers. Victor has a pattern, 3 short zigzags followed by a longer straight run, then repeat. We need to target the beginning of that straight run, just as he thinks he's evaded us. Calculating manually, Jolly, Ramirez confirmed, his hands steady on the controls as he input the adjustments. Target now 2,800 meters from harbor entrance, Chen reported urgently. We're running out of time. Fire when ready, Michael ordered, his voice calm despite the pressure. Ramirez took a deep breath, made a final minute adjustment, and fired. The tank rocked with the recoil, and once again they watched through the thermal imaging as the round arced toward its target. This time, despite the vessel's evasive maneuver, the shot found its mark. Hit! Ramirez shouted triumphantly. But their celebration was premature. The thermal image showed damage to the vessel, but it continued moving, though at a reduced speed. Partial hit, Jim assessed. We damaged it, but didn't stop it. One more shot, Michael decided. Chen, load the last specialized round. As Chen loaded the final anti-ship round, Michael turned to Jim. Any suggestions for this one, Colonel? Jim studied the thermal image, noting how the damaged vessel was moving. He's listing to starboard, trying to compensate with port engine power. Target the port side just below the waterline. If we can disable that engine completely, the starboard list will increase until he capsizes. Michael nodded. Ramirez, you heard the Colonel. Manual targeting, port side below the waterline. Target acquired, Ramirez confirmed after making the necessary adjustments. Firing. The final specialized round thundered from the main gun, streaking through the rainy night toward the distant vessel. This time there was no doubt about the result. The round struck precisely where intended, and the thermal imaging showed the vessel immediately listing heavily to starboard. Direct hit, Ramirez announced. Target is taking on water and losing all forward momentum. They watched as the thermal signature of the vessel gradually diminished, the heat of its engines fading as water flooded the compartments. Target neutralized, Chen confirmed after several tense minutes of observation. No movement, no engine signature. A collective exhale of relief filled the cramped interior of the tank. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but Jim felt no sense of triumph. Instead, a strange emptiness settled over him as he watched the thermal image of Victor Kane's vessel slowly disappearing beneath the waves. SEAL Team 4 reports successful engagement of the southern vessel, Chen added, monitoring the communications channel. All hostile targets neutralized. Ray clapped a hand on Jim's shoulder. We did it, boss. The Iron Wolves came through again. Jim nodded absently, his mind still focused on the sinking vessel. Have the SEALs check for survivors, he instructed. I want confirmation of Victor's status. Michael seemed to understand Jim's reluctance to celebrate. It won't feel finished until we know for certain, will it? No, Jim admitted. Victor has cheated death before. As the adrenaline of combat began to fade, the physical toll of the past days caught up with them. Michael winced visibly as he shifted position, his cracked ribs and other injuries making themselves felt once more. The rest of the crew showed similar signs of exhaustion and pain. Stand down to minimum alert status, Jim ordered. Maintain position here until we receive confirmation from the SEAL team, but everyone should rest while they can. You've earned it. As the crew relaxed slightly, Jim climbed out of the tank's hatch, needing a moment alone. The storm was beginning to subside, the rain reduced to a gentle drizzle as dawn approached. In the distance, the lights of San Diego twinkled, its residents still asleep, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. Ray followed him out, offering a cigarette which Jim declined with a shake of his head. 30 years ago, we were celebrating victory in Iraq, Ray remarked, lighting the cigarette for himself. Now here we are, two old soldiers still fighting. Some battles never really end, Jim replied quietly. They just change form. Think it's over this time? For real? Jim stared out at the dark ocean where Victor Kane's vessel had disappeared. I don't know, Ray. I hope so. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Michael emerged from the tank and joined them. The three men stood in silence, two veterans and one still in his prime, united by duty, sacrifice, and the legacy of the Iron Wolves. My father would have been proud, Michael said suddenly, of both of you, of all of us. Jim turned to look at Frank Wilson's son, seeing in the young man's eyes a new understanding. He would have been proudest of you, Michael. You commanded with the same courage and clarity he always showed. Michael reached into his pocket and withdrew the wolf pin. After he died, I built this image in my head of what happened, that somehow you could have saved him but didn't, that you left him behind. Jim remained silent, allowing Michael the space to continue. My mother always told me that wasn't true, but I needed someone to blame. Michael's fingers closed around the pin. I think I understand now what really happened, what it means to command men in battle, to make impossible decisions, to live with the consequences. He extended his hand, offering the wolf pin to Jim, This belongs with you, with the original Iron Wolves. Jim gently pushed Michael's hand back. No, your father wanted you to have it. The legacy continues through you, not me. Michael considered this, then slowly pinned the wolf emblem to his uniform. Then I'll wear it with honor, sir. The sun crested the horizon, casting long rays across the landscape, still glistening with rain. The dawn of a new day, hard-won through sacrifice and courage. Jim's satellite phone buzzed, breaking the moment. The display showed Eleanor West's secure number. Callahan, he answered. It's confirmed, Jim. Eleanor's voice came through clearly. SEAL Team 4 recovered Victor's body from the command vessel. DNA verification complete. It's really him this time. A complex mix of emotions washed through Jim. Relief, sadness, a sense of completion tinged with loss. Thank you, Ellie. The President sends his personal thanks to you and the Phoenix team, Eleanor continued. The mission is officially complete. You're ordered to stand down and return to Camp Pendleton for debriefing. Understood. We'll move out shortly. As Jim ended the call, both Ray and Michael were watching him expectantly. Victor? Ray asked simply. Confirmed killed in action, Jim replied. It's over. The three men stood in silence, absorbing the finality of the moment. 30 years of history, from the deserts of Iraq to the California coast, had come full circle. Orders? Michael asked finally, ever the professional. Return to Camp Pendleton for debriefing, Jim reported. Mission complete. As they turned back toward the tank, Jim felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not entirely, perhaps, but significantly. Frank Wilson's death would always be with him, but now, having fought alongside his son and completed this final mission, Jim sensed the possibility of peace. The Iron Wolves had hunted one last time, and this time they were all coming home. Chapter 15, Steel Legacy. 1 year later. Arlington National Cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, dew glistening on the grass between the rows of white headstones. Jim Callahan stood before Frank Wilson's grave, his posture straight despite the cane he now used for support. The heart attack he had suffered during the debriefing at Camp Pendleton had finally forced him into permanent retirement. But he had survived, thanks largely to the swift action of Michael Wilson, who had recognized the symptoms and insisted on immediate medical evacuation. Jim placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave, then stepped back respectfully. Beside him, Michael stood in his dress uniform, recently adorned with the oak leaves of a newly promoted major. 31 years, Jim remarked quietly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Michael nodded in understanding. Mom says time is strange that way, especially with the people we've lost. Some days they feel centuries away. Other days, it's like they just stepped out of the room. They stood in companionable silence, united in remembrance. The past year had brought many changes. The Phoenix Deterrent Program had been officially recognized and expanded, with Michael appointed as its commanding officer. Ray Martinez had finally retired for good, accepting a position as an instructor at the Armor School at Fort Benning. Chief Chen had been promoted and placed in charge of further developing the targeting system based on Admiral Whitfield's calculations. And Jim had returned home to Sarah, keeping his promise to make this his last mission. His recovery from the heart attack had been slow but steady, and though he would never again command in the field, his expertise remained valuable as an advisor to the expanding Phoenix program. I received the official notification yesterday, Michael said, breaking the silence. The Phoenix Coastal Defense Academy is being renamed. Oh? Jim raised an eyebrow inquiringly. The Callahan-Wilson School of Adaptive Warfare, Michael announced with a hint of pride, honoring both our contributions to the program. Jim felt a lump form in his throat. That's quite an honor. A deserved one, Michael insisted. What we accomplished that night off San Diego has changed military doctrine. The integration of historical tactics with modern technology, the use of land-based systems for maritime defense. It's revolutionizing how we approach asymmetric threats. Jim nodded, thinking of the expanded program now underway, with Phoenix tanks deployed at strategic coastal positions nationwide, their crews trained in the techniques pioneered during their mission against Victor Kane. Your father would have loved being part of this, Jim said. He always had a talent for thinking outside conventional boundaries. Like father, like son, I suppose, Michael replied with a small smile. And speaking of sons, he hesitated, then continued. Sarah mentioned you're expecting a grandson soon? Jim's face brightened. Lisa's due next month. They're naming him James Franklin Carson, after me and your father. That's wonderful news, sir. Jim, he corrected gently. I think we're well past formalities at this point, don't you? Michael nodded in acknowledgement. Jim it is then. From his pocket, Jim withdrew a small box. I have something for you. Was going to wait for a more formal occasion, but here seems appropriate somehow. Michael accepted the box curiously and opened it to reveal a silver wolf pendant identical to the one Jim wore, but newer, the ruby eyes catching the morning light. The original Iron Wolves had these made after Desert Storm, Jim explained. I thought it was time for the tradition to continue with the new generation. Michael lifted the pendant from the box, visibly moved by the gesture. I'll wear it with honor. Your father would be proud of the man you've become, Jim said sincerely. Not just for your military accomplishments, but for your character, your leadership, your willingness to heal old wounds. Michael carefully placed the pendant around his neck, then straightened, looking at his father's grave. I think he knows, somehow. They stood together a moment longer, two soldiers united by history, sacrifice, and mutual respect. The older passing the torch to the younger, the legacy continuing. As they turned to leave, Michael paused. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, something that's bothered me since San Diego. What's that? When we engaged Victor's command vessel, that final shot, the targeting solution was almost impossible, even with the manual adjustments. How did you know it would work? Jim considered his answer carefully. I didn't know, not with certainty, but I understood Victor's thinking, his patterns, and I trusted your crew's abilities, especially Ramirez's instincts as a gunner. He smiled slightly. Sometimes leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting your people to find them. Michael absorbed this wisdom with a thoughtful nod. One more question, if I may. That night when the Phoenix tank was damaged in the explosion at Fort Bliss, you could have scrubbed the mission, waited for repairs or reinforcements. But you didn't. Why risk everything on a single tank? Jim's expression grew serious. Because sometimes, Michael, one is all you need. One person, one idea, one chance to make a difference. He glanced back at Frank's grave. Your father taught me that. At 73 Easting, when his single tank held off an entire company of Iraqi T-72s while the rest of us regrouped. One tank making all the difference. Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. The legacy of the Iron Wolves. Exactly, Jim confirmed. Not just about fighting together, but about each member being willing to stand alone when necessary. As they walked slowly through the cemetery toward the waiting cars, Jim felt a sense of completion. The mission against Victor Khan had begun as a final duty, a last service to his country. It had become something more, a bridge between generations, a healing of old wounds, a passing of the torch. The Iron Wolves would continue their legacy through Michael and his team, adapting to new threats with the wisdom of the past and the technology of the future. And somewhere, Jim liked to think, Frank Wilson was watching with approval as his son carried forward the emblem of the pack. What will you do now? Michael asked as they reached the cemetery gates. With retirement, I mean. Jim smiled, thinking of Sarah waiting at home, of the grandson soon to arrive, of the peaceful days ahead interspersed with occasional consulting work for the Phoenix program. Live, he answered simply, just live. As they parted ways, each to their respective responsibilities, Jim touched the wolf pendant that had been with him through 3 decades of service. The pack endured, the legacy continued, and the future, for once, looked bright with promise. The hunt was over. It was time to come home. The end.